If you like scary video games, then you've probably heard of a recent indie title known as Lethal Company. And if you haven't, all you need to know is that one guy who is best known for making Roblox games decided to make a standalone game, and it outsold Call of Duty. The game consists of you and 3 of your friends, or at least strangers who hopefully know how a microphone works, traveling to distant moons across space in the far future in order to retrieve scrap and feed some kind of massive beast.
Oh my god! Oh my...
This format allows for scenarios that can be as terrifying as they can be hilarious, which is a large reason for the game's success. However, I think another reason that the game has been so successful, at least in the lasting impact it leaves with people who play it, is the mystery. See, everything I just described is pretty much everything we know for a fact. You are traveling to moons, it's at some point in the future, you're collecting scrap, and there's a lot of monsters. Everything else about the game is called into question. Why are we collecting this scrap for the monster? Who is the company that is forcing us into these dangerous scenarios? What happened to everyone else? Why is everywhere we visit an abandoned mine or an abandoned mansion? Why does it seem that in the universe of the game, something really bad happened to the people that used to live here? And if so, why does the company keep telling us that we have to go back? That's what I want to talk about today. Entire corners of the internet, from YouTubers to modding communities, have been built up around this game. And in just focusing on the lore and hidden story, I don't want to overwrite them or act that the mystery of the game is its only founding point. Regardless of what you learn in this video, Lethal Company is a fantastic game that's enjoyable by yourself or especially with friends. There will be a link to the Steam page in the description, and if you somehow haven't heard about this game before this video, then I can't recommend it enough. But what I want to do in this video is go over the locations, the monsters, the lore, the hidden logs, the hidden moons, and everything the game has to offer in order to ask the question, what is this all about? And hopefully with that we can piece together my theory, at least, for the story of Lethal Company. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about a lot of awful ways that a ton of people died and a lot of horrible monsters that want to kill us, which if you're subbed to this channel, you're probably into for some reason.
And another thing that can sometimes be miserable is eating healthy. Because often the healthier option is harder to get a hold of, harder to make, or just more expensive than the unhealthy option, which as someone who watches YouTube videos, I'm sure you're all too familiar with. But that's where today's sponsor, Factor, is here to help. Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your door. That's because Factor's easy-to-make meals are ready in just 2 minutes, and you can choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or vegan and veggie diets. Factor allows you to skip the grocery stores, the cooking, the prep work, and instead you just get chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals that are as tasty as they are good for you. Because unlike other microwavable options, Factor's food tastes the way food is supposed to. You know, real. And with such a variety of meal options, I'm sure you'll find something you'll love. There's this one Factor meal that's like a rice kind of queso Tex-Mex mix that whenever it comes in, my wife and I immediately fight for it in the package because we both love it so much. And on top of that, Factor's very flexible, kind of like that guy. And you can change your plans each week to get 4 to 18 meals per week or pause or reschedule your deliveries at any time. And on top of that, you can get meal add-ons like breakfast, on-the-go lunch, snacks, and beverages. Really, there's nothing to not love. And if you want to be a part of this delicious, healthy meal option, then there's never been a better time to get it on the offer. That is because right now, if you head to the link in the description at factor75.com and use the discount code 50Wendigoon, you'll be able to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free shipping. That is right, half off your first box plus free shipping. Again, all you have to do is use discount code 50Wendigoon and head to factor75.com to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all so much for watching the ad. Thank you to Factor for sponsoring the channel. Their link is in the description, and we are back to the video.
We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Now, when you boot up the game for the first time, in recent updates, you're going to see a cutscene. We'll talk about those cutscenes later. For now, let's just get to your first day on the job. I think one of the things that makes Lethal Company so effective is how immersive the game is once you get into it. Because as soon as you join a lobby, you immediately load into the dropship you'll be using for the duration of the game. And you'll also be presented with this catchy jingle.
Welcome to your first day on the job. This is your very own autopilot ship, where you will eat and sleep for the duration of your contract.
On this dropship, we'll see a bunch of items that will become mainstays for the rest of our journey. Among the terminals, bunk beds, and a storage locker, we'll see some posters that kind of give a setting to the world we're in. Things like a poster encouraging us to ration our food for the benefit of our fellow man, as well as a post-it note that tells us we're in too deep and gives us a secret code to use on the terminal, but all that for later. What we'll quickly find out is that the world of Lethal Company takes place far, far into the future, after humanity has began its expeditions into the stars. And one of my favorite things about Lethal Company is whereas a lot of space exploration stories will place their narrative at the beginning or in the midst of humanity colonizing outer planets, instead Lethal Company seems to take place in the remnants of that. This is at first made apparent by the ship itself. Despite being set in the far, far future, the ship we find ourselves on only contains the bare minimum. The setting itself contains no luxuries, not even a window. It's something more akin to a submarine than a far future spaceship. And where this becomes especially apparent is on the moons that we visit. The only directive that we are given is that the company wants us to land on these moons that at some point had a level of society or civilization built into them, but now everyone's gone. We'll get into the specific locations in a moment, but across the board, every exterior we visit looks like a fallout shelter. Every exterior has a tone of a very brutalist architecture, with heavy cement walls and metal doors. It seems that the people who built these locations were doing everything in their power to make the structure secure from things on the outside that want to come in. And as we'll see when we get to the monsters, that was probably a good call. Some of the moons that you'll visit are just that. It is a structure that you can enter into, and then maybe something like a walkway or a bridge that leads to the front door. And on planets where there's more structures than just the primary building, every structure that we see is something industrial. It's either train tracks or warehouses. It points to the idea that people that were living on these moons weren't doing so passively. And it implies that all of the infrastructure we see was just intended to be the first level of a society. Either the construction that took place on these moons was intended to lead to more construction that would eventually be communities, housing, and things like that, or these moons exclusively existed as resource gathering for other moons or other places people were living. But again, considering we're the only ones here, it doesn't look like they got that far. But if we're here being sent by the company to collect scrap on these planets, then that means humanity still has to be existing somewhere out in space, right? We'll get to that. For now, all we need to know is that the company is sending us to these abandoned planets to collect scrap. And if you're not familiar with the game, you're probably thinking, well, that makes sense. A lot of these planets were mining colonies or industry colonies. There's probably a lot of expensive technology and equipment left behind, right? Well, probably, but that's not what the company has us collecting. The company has us collecting junk. Quite literally junk in a lot of cases. Some of the most common scrap you'll find is tattered sheet metal or empty bottles. Other times you'll find seemingly useless items like laser pointers or a whisk, or sometimes, quite hauntingly, children's toys. So that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Why would a company be investing however much money they're investing? I mean, space travel can't be that cheap. Why are they investing this much money to send us to these abandoned planets to collect rubber duckies? That is a great question, but before we answer that, let's talk about a few of the specific locations we'll be sent to, as well as a few of the specific things we'll run into while we're there. Going to the ship's terminal allows you to pick what moon you and your crew are going to land at. This is one of the things I mean about the game is so immersive once you're playing it, because other than hitting the pause menu to adjust your settings, every menu within the game is a part of the game itself. This touch is something known as diegetic UI, which is another way to say that the interface the user is playing with is a part of the actual in-game world. Think about how in games like Dead Space, your health and ammo are displayed on the character itself. Now, Lethal Company doesn't fully commit to the bit. There are some elements of a heads-up display, like your character's health, that aren't completely baked into the world itself, but little touches like this help immerse the player. On the ship terminal, you can not only pick what moon you go to, but read information about said moon. And it's here we get the first clues of the world that our game takes place in. The primary moons, or essentially levels of Lethal Company, are broken into 3 different difficulties: easy, medium, and hard, or easy, intermediate, expert, whatever. When you land on different moons, the game will show you what the ranking for that moon is as far as difficulty is concerned, but I wouldn't give a ton of thought to it because outside of the very hard moons that exist in the final tier, you can pretty much consider these subjective. Like how some of the desert planets are ranked higher than some of the forest planets because they contain things like blind dogs and earth leviathans, but I die to the forest keeper all the time, so I don't know what it's talking about. The moon that is typically agreed upon to be the easiest in the game, as well as the one most new players will come across, is the first map listed in the game, Experimentation. Now, every moon will spawn one of 3 different types of interior areas, but for now we're just talking about the exterior of the map. On the ship's terminal, Experimentation is described as abandoned, as are the other moons we come across in the game. The environment of Experimentation seems to be a kind of dry desert area, but the front of the facility itself looks to be an old industrial yard. We see train tracks and train yards, things that kind of look like old water towers, as well as several other structures around the facility that we explore in the game. The ship's terminal tells us that Experimentation is not only abandoned, but also was used in secret. Now this implies a lot of things. It's one thing for future societies to go to far-off moons and planets and begin to develop industry and technology. It's another if those future societies are so large that parts of those societies can build secret moon bases from other parts of societies. Especially with the breadth of construction we just see in the little view of Experimentation that we have, this implies that there's several other moons just like this, and other societies that for some reason, some would want to keep development of a moon secret from another. In comparison, there's not a lot to say about our second moon, Assurance, which is described in the terminal as being a twin to Experimentation and was discovered not long before Experimentation. By comparison, Assurance seems to be much less developed, but again, if it was discovered before, it's probably safe to assume that the little corner of the planet we see isn't all of the development that happened on this moon. I'm probably going to goof up and use the word planet to describe some of these environments like I just did. Everything that we land on, at least so far in Lethal Company, is considered a moon, but you get it, big floating rock in space, moon, planet, whatever. All of the Wendigoon astronomers are going to be livid in the comment section. However, things change up a bit with the last moon in the easy category, a moon known as Vow. Whereas the previous 2 moons seemed to be arid, desert-like conditions, Vow looks like a forest. And whereas it, along with 2 other moons we'll talk about in a minute, are considered the Green Witches, we can assume that this greenery extends around the moon's entire surface. Similar to the previous 2 moons, after the ship lands and you walk for a little bit through the landscape, you get to a large concrete structure that contains a door and allows you to enter the interior. However, it is the description of this moon that calls some things into question. The history of the planet, according to the ship's terminal, says Vow appears to have been inhabited by several colonies across its continents, but there is now no sign of life, and they have become a mystery. Now, this is strange. For one, this confirms the suspicion that there are several different societies living over seemingly the entire habitable surface of these moons, and that several of these colonized moon planets exist across space. However, for one, how big is the population of, people if an entire moon's worth of humans can just vanish and it is chalked up as a mystery? It reminds me of legends like the lost colony of Roanoke, right? The English colony in the now United States that just disappeared and no one knows where they went. There's a bunch of legends and stories about what happened to the colony of Roanoke. So imagine that same story, but it is blown up to a planet's population of people. For one, it goes to show the sheer population of humanity in Lethal Company's world, but it also begs the question, what could have wiped out an entire moon's worth of people? This is also potentially where new players will be introduced to fire exits. Every interior within Lethal Company has at least 2 modes of entry. You have your main entrance up front, and then a fire exit hidden somewhere else on the building's exterior. On experimentation and insurance, the fire exits are just stuck somewhere on the outside of the structure, but in VOW, the fire exit is given a lot of prominence. You enter the main entrance by crossing one of 2 bridges that go over a very deep ravine, and at the base of that ravine is a fire exit. Now, fire exits don't make spatial sense when it comes to their placement inside of a structure. For example, on the outside of a facility, you can have the main entrance to the right and the fire exit to the left, and then you enter through the main entrance and the fire exit is your first door on the right. But if you take that fire exit, it will still spit you out where the fire exit is located outside over on the left. This is because all of the interiors of Lethal Company are procedurally generated, so every time you enter a map, it has a new layout. One of the reasons that the game remains fresh to players who have played it for a really long time. Because of that, you can kind of think of the exterior fire exits as being their canon position or the way the structure is supposed to be thought of being laid out within the world. All of that to say, when you get to VOW and you see the fire exit at the bottom of the ravine, it implies that this entire colony existed underground. We have the actual bunker of the main entrance, but the fire exit being down there implies that there's probably a whole network of hallways and living spaces underground that these several civilizations used to live in. For one, that paints kind of the dire situation that humanity exists within, at least humanity as they go to these moons. As these colonies, groups that supposedly consist of families and large groups of people, have to exist underground with no windows, completely hidden from the outside world. And secondly, in spite of all of those protections, something wiped them out. After VOW, we move into the first of the intermediate moons, that moon being a fence. According to the ship's terminal, at some point in the past, a fence splintered off from Assurance and became its own moon. This is apparent as the landscape of a fence is pretty much identical to Assurance, being a very dry desert climate. However, on a fence, we see several structures that seem to be in a further state of disarray than they were on Assurance. We see large metal catwalks and platforms that are half submerged in rock and sand. There are these massive metal pipes that run on the surface of the planet, one of which leading all the way to the fire exit located near the back of the facility. But as with the rest of the planets, it seems that no one's been there for quite some time. As a matter of fact, a fence's description inside of the ship's terminal gives one of the most harrowing implications out of any of the moons in the game. In its history, it says that a fence is categorized as an asteroid moon and seems to have not existed on its own for more than several hundred years. That makes sense because it is described as a moon that broke off from Assurance and is now its own thing, so asteroid moon for the past several hundred years. Got it. But then it says, the industrial artifacts here have suffered damage. It's believed they were built long before a fence was splintered off. Wait, so that means that the structures that we are seeing on a fence were built before it split off from Assurance several hundred years ago. For one, that explains why everything's in a state of disarray. I mean, imagine if you built something on a part of the Earth and then that place quit being a part of the Earth. But that raises some implications. Like, for one, what do you mean is believed to be? Not only the fact that the ruins we are going over are hundreds of years since abandoned, which is a really long time when it comes to, human history and all that, but also believed to be? So in other words, we don't know who actually built these things, implying that the breadth of humanity is so large and so many things have happened to it that we can't even keep track of what group or when this stuff was built. And also, if several hundred years is considered recently to have broken off, then what does a long time ago mean? Does that mean these structures were built 1,000, 2,000 years ago? And if that's the case, why are we just now going through them in 4-man crews to look for scrap? Again, one of my favorite things about Lethal Company is the way it makes the player feel like they are participating in an intergalactic dark age. Humanity used to be great. We used to conquest moons, to build empires, but now we're just picking through the remains for scrap. After that, we move on to another intermediate planet, March. March is very similar to VOW. As a matter of fact, in the ship's terminal, it says that March is a twin moon to VOW. And much like VOW, March seems to have a very forested green structure. March does have a unique feature compared to the other moons, and that is more than one fire exit. As a matter of fact, March has 3. This gives you a total of 4 different means of entry into the facility. Similar to Vow, these fire exits are built into the earth around the main entrance. And considering we don't see a ton of signs of production like we do on Experimentation and Offense, we can assume that, like Vow, March was also a colony planet, or the moon itself was at least used for colonies and people as much as it was for industrialization or something. In other words, the planet itself wasn't just a big factory. However, the thing that March has above Vow is that March seems to be really big. Not only does 3 fire exits imply that the structure of the interior itself is pretty big, but the map itself is pretty big when you play it. I know we haven't talked about interiors yet, and we'll get to those, but as I mentioned earlier, every interior in the game is procedurally generated, meaning that every time you land on a planet, you're going to have the same exterior, but a different interior when you walk into the building. The only thing about the interior that is affected by the moon you choose to land on is the percent chance of what kind of interior spawns in, and the size of the interior that spawns in. And if I recall right, next to Titan, which is a moon we'll talk about in a bit, March has the largest interior of any moon in the game. So in other words, you have this massive, massive colony that it says in the description was overlooked because it's right next to Vow, and despite its massive size and, again, the formidableness of how the structure was built, how secure it seemed to be built, no one's there. The final intermediate planet that we can travel to is a planet known as Adamance. This is the 3rd of the Green Witches, and similar to Vow and March, has a forested exterior. The only real unique structure that seems to be connected to the facility itself is a large tower that can be seen off in the distance to the right of the facility, that you can actually get to with a jetpack, but nothing's up there. However, underneath the main bridge that allows you to pass over a gap to the main entrance of the facility, there is a small cottage. If the player has a key to unlock the door to the cottage, in the back room they can find, spray painted on the wall, 68 art, which is something we will talk about later. We now move into the 3 hard or highest difficulty moons in the game. And it's here where the environment gets a little bit interesting. What separates these moons from the rest is, for one, the intensity of the, we'll call it, wildlife that can appear on the planet, that again we'll get to in a minute, but also the fact that these 3 planets require money to even visit them. Money that you have to acquire by selling scrap you get from the previous 6 planets mentioned. So you have to play for a while to build up enough money in the previous 6 moons that I've mentioned to even get to these 3. The first of these hard planets is Rend, and Rend gives us a considerable change in scenery. That's because as soon as you land on Rend, you will see that it is an ice-covered, snowy moon. As a matter of fact, the blizzards are so intense that your visibility is incredibly limited. As a matter of fact, the ship's terminal says that it's highly unlikely for complex life to exist there. But if you've played the moon, you know that's a lie. In the ship's terminal, it says that several famous travelers went missing here, giving it some reputation. Their bodies are unlikely to be found due to the planet's conditions. But in spite of that, in spite of the inhospitality of the planet, there is still a superstructure there for us to explore. That means that, again, humanity was so advanced they were able to build entire colonies on snow moons like this. And again, similar to the forested planets and the desert planets, something wiped everyone out. It's also with Rend we get into one of the more unique interiors that we can encounter in the game, but we'll get to that later. The second of the hard moons that the player can come across is a moon known as Dine. Dine is pretty much exactly like Rend, down to the description. Because of this, it can be assumed that, similar to Assurance and Offense, that Dine and Rend are effectively twin moons. This explains why they both have a pretty much identical condition, but the condition on Dine seems to be a bit more intense than Rend's. Whereas on Rend, there's at least a series of lamps that lead the way from the dropship to the front of the structure. On Dine, you just have a few lights scattered about at random. While this may imply less construction or further decay on Dine as opposed to Rend, both of the planets are once again abandoned. One outside structure that Rend has over Dine is, as you're following the paths of lights to the front of the facility on Rend, you can come across a small cottage. As a matter of fact, the exact same cottage that can be found on Adamance. However, this one doesn't need a key to get into and does not contain the writing that says 68 art in the backroom wall. Now, while it can be assumed that this was put there by Sigurd, the game's developer, to help players who are struggling with the wildlife of the region, it also kind of implies, along with the lights being in order, that Rind was a bit better off than Dine, but again, doesn't really matter now, as both are abandoned. However, it's the final moon that we're going to talk about for now that seems to be the most interesting. On its surface, Titan seems to have the same sort of environment that Rind and Dine have, that being a snowy, blizzard-ridden environment. However, what is different about Titan compared to those two moons is its structure. As soon as you land on Titan, you are greeted with a massive monolith of a building. One that takes several flights of stairs to get up to the entrance of, and even past that, it keeps going on and on up into the sky. Now, despite this size and what the ship's terminal says, where it states that it has many entrances, the building itself only has the standard main entrance and fire exit. But in spite of that, we can see that this building goes on for quite a ways. As a matter of fact, Titan has the largest interior for any moon in the game. In the ship's terminal, it says, quote, "It looks like this moon was mined for resources." For one, that is similar to moons like Experimentation, where it seems to be more of an industrial setting instead of a livable one. And again, it points towards the scope of humanity being large enough to colonize entire moons just as resource mining. However, some of the most interesting details we get about Titan aren't when we actually land on the planet and aren't in the description of the planet itself. It's in the descriptions we get from other things in the game. Now, there are 2 secret moons in the game, but I'll talk about those later when you have more context to make them make sense. For now, all you need to know is that these 9 moons are where the majority of the game takes place, and that as you go from easy to hard, the scrap you can find on these moons becomes more valuable, which in turn allows you to do better at the game, as you can use that scrap money to buy weapons or ship tools and upgrades that help you survive within the world of Lethal Company. But it is the things that you have to survive that make these moons so difficult. For one, the moons themselves can kill you. Every moon has a random chance to be foggy, which gives you low visibility, flooded, which causes flood waters to rise that you can slip into and drown, stormy, which causes lightning to randomly strike and strike metallic objects you're holding, and most terrifying of all, eclipsed, which you'll soon realize why that's so terrible. But as anyone who has played Lethal Company knows, the planet is the least of your concern, because it's everything on the planet that you need to be worried about. And it's with the monsters that inhabit these moons that the world of Lethal Company really opens up. So let's talk about them. So with each of the moons you can land on, as mentioned earlier, there is an interior to the facilities you'll enter. And while technically all of the moons have a chance to spawn a different kind of interior, it's pretty clear that certain maps were meant for certain interiors. This is proven by looking at the percentage chance several facilities have to spawn a given interior. These 3 interiors are a factory or facility, a mine shaft, which was added in more recent updates to the game, and a mansion. The facility seems far and away the most common interior, and it's also the one that most players are probably familiar with, so we'll start there. The interior design of a facility map is very bland and dry. The layout consists almost entirely of concrete bricks and metal catwalks. And this makes sense given a lot of the locations we can visit in the game. These moons were used as production facilities, so a lot of the scapes that we enter are industrial. Areas with large conveyor belts will have mine carts and shelves meant to house tooling. Storage rooms will consist of rusted shelves and old generators. These facilities will have power in some locations, while power is also out in others. And facility interiors will feature a power room in which a single device known as an apparatus is being used to power the facility itself in some small way. An apparatus that can be taken by the player and then sold for money, although removing the apparatus kills what little power there is within the facility. The player can also come across heavy industrial doors that can only be opened by someone going back to the ship's terminal and typing in the letter and number that appear on the door itself. And doors throughout the facility may occasionally be locked, but can be unlocked with keys that can also be found within the facility. These harsh textures, mixed with a lack of living quarters that we see while exploring the facility, give the entire air of this future humanity's conquest of industry a very cold, isolated feeling. But you may not have time to think about that, given all of the things that really want to kill you while you're there. And again, to clarify, pretty much any of the creatures in the game can spawn on any map. They just have higher or lower percentage chance to spawn depending on what moon you're on. But I'm going to start with the creatures that you are most likely to see early game within facility interiors. One of the early game creatures you may run into is something known as the snare flea. The snare flea is effectively a giant centipede that clings to the ceiling, and whenever you walk under it, the flea drops down and begins to suffocate you. The snare flea is very terrifying to new players because one second they will be walking around oblivious as can be, and then the next, a giant bug texture thing is covering up their entire screen. One of Lethal Company's most standout features is its use of proximity chat. Aside from walkie-talkies that can be purchased while you're in the game, proximity chat is the only means of communication players within a lobby have, or at least the only method of voice communication. The proximity chat in Lethal Company is very adaptive in that depending if you're on the outside or inside of a structure, the voice sounds different. If you're inside of metal walls, the voice will be echoey. If the person's standing further away, it will sound more faded out. And in cases like this, when a snare flea falls on someone, the voice becomes incredibly muffled, which can be difficult if you just had a giant bug fall on your head and you're trying to yell at another player for help, who now can't hear you because you have a giant bug on your head. There are a few ways to deal with a snare flea if one falls on your head. For one, if someone else has a weapon, they can use it to simply hit the bug and the bug will fall off. When a snare flea lands on your head, it causes you to drop everything in your inventory, but if you were previously holding a weapon and can manage to find it on the ground even though your screen's covered up, you can pick it back up and knock it off yourself. For every creature in the game, or nearly every creature in the game, you can go to the computer's terminal and access a log that describes the creature. This database is known as the bestiary, and in the bestiary for the snare flea, it says that they don't like being outside. And true to form, if a snare flea lands on your head and you manage to locate an exit, as soon as you leave the facility, the flea will fall off of your head, now dead. In the later game, players can also purchase a teleporter that allows someone on the ship to teleport people inside of the facility back to the ship itself. So if a snare flea is on your head and you get teleported, the flea will die because it is now, once again, outside. Or if a flea falls on your head and you don't have a weapon and there's no way to get teleported or back outside, then you can do the right thing and throw yourself into a pit. Because as soon as the snare flea suffocates a player to death, it will just go reset itself to attack someone else. So you can at least be a hero in your final moments and take yourself out like a man. However, one of the most interesting things that is mentioned in the snare flea's bestiary is that the scientific name for it is Dolus scolopendra. Whatever. Scolopendra is a genus of real-world centipedes. And I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? The snare flea is a very centipede-looking creature, so it makes sense that they would name it after real-world centipedes. But also, in the real world, that's not really how scientific names work, right? It's not just because something looks like something else we give it a scientific name. It's based on, you know, phylum, kingdom, class, order, family, genus, species. You took 6th grade science, right? What am I saying? I'm Wendigoon. Most of you guys probably aren't even to the 6th grade yet. So that's interesting that the scientific name of this alien bug would be the same as a creature on Earth. Things to consider. Another creature you will probably run into in the early game is something known as a spore lizard. Now, the first time you encounter a spore lizard, you will probably be very afraid of it, as they are large, have a really big mouth, and like to hiss at you. However, it is incredibly hard to get killed by a spore lizard because they are terrified of people. As a matter of fact, according to their bestiary, they are herbivores. This is evidenced by their behavior in the game, because if a player approaches a spore lizard, after it hisses at you, it will then run away. If the player continues to chase after the spore lizard, it will emit a cloud of purple smoke, I guess, into the air. This is because, according to the bestiary, the purple bulb on the end of their tail secretes a chemical that encourages the growth of a type of fungus. And the purple spore cloud itself doesn't even hurt you, it just clouds your vision. Only after continuing to chase a spore lizard will it start to bite you, to which its bite is very weak. The only way a spore lizard can become a problem is if you're running from something else and have to keep running in the direction the spore lizard is, and cause it to throw its purple smoke in the air, which would hurt your vision. And I guess if you're cornered in a room with one, then it would start to bite you, but you could probably just stand on like the other side of the room. The spore lizards actually make me incredibly sad, because according to their bestiary, it says there are historical records that spore lizards were at least partially domesticated hundreds of years ago. However, this effort was set aside by an initiative to harvest their tails for their medicinal property. Aw. Like these guys used to be humanity's friend, and then when we figured out we can make medicine out of their tail, so we started killing them. And now they still won't attack us for it, they just get scared and run away. That's depressing. For one, this gives some interesting lore complications. As mentioned earlier, this humanity in the future is so old that we built entire civilizations and colonies that have now been abandoned for several hundred years themselves. And this further backs that up, saying that hundreds of years ago we domesticated this supposed alien race of creature, only to then abandon it. So that again implies enough time for a rise of something before we fall out. The other interesting lore implication of the spore lizard is in its name. For one, the fungus that grows around their tail is from the genus Lycoperdon, who cares? Which in real life is a type of fern that grows from a spore. So again, that is a connection to this alien thing from a real world thing. But in the description for the spore lizard itself, it says that they are of the family Alligatoridae, which in the real world is alligators. So this weird giant mouth spore lizard thing is of the family of Earth alligators. Similar to the snare flea, it is something in far distant space that is related somehow to things we have on Earth. And another example of this is a creature that can often be found in facility structures, the thumper. The thumper is probably responsible for the heart attack of many new players, because at first all you can hear is the thumping of its two fists across the ground before one sees you and begins to charge at you as fast as it can. In the bestiary, it says they're also referred to as halves, which makes sense as they seem to be half a torso attached by two fists and a really big head with a lot of teeth. Unlike the spore lizard, they have an incredibly powerful bite that will kill you fast if you don't know what to do about it. It used to be a well-known exploit in the game that if you stood on railings in facility structures, things like thumpers couldn't get to you, but now that's been patched, so there's no safe place except like juking it out or running. You can kill nearly every creature in the game, but it takes a lot of work and coordination. Some of the only weapons that players can get in the game until much later stages of the game are things like a shovel, stop sign, or yield sign, which all have the same use of just rearing back and hitting something really hard. So if you're trying to fight a thumper, you have to be able to hit it and then juke it out before it can retaliate, which again, pretty difficult. Thankfully, thumpers are deaf, meaning that the players can talk to each other as much as they want or make as much noise as they want throughout the facility and not worry about a nearby thumper hearing them. However, if a thumper has you in its line of sight, good luck. Oh yeah, that's another detail if you weren't aware. A lot of these creatures can hear you and will hear you talking to other people or crying into your walkie-talkie. Thumpers are brutal. As a matter of fact, the bestiary says that the reason they look the way they do is because in order to escape their eggs whenever they're hatched, they have to chew off the lower portion of their body. And as with the previous two entries, they seem to have a connection to creatures back on Earth. As in the bestiary, along with the previous two entries, it says that they are of the order Chondrichthyes, which is species of cartilaginous fish that exist in the real world that include things like sharks, meaning that these creatures are somehow related to sharks from Earth. At the bottom of the bestiary, it has the note where it says, due to the fast and volatile evolution of this species, some theorize that thumpers are one of the examples of an increased number of mutations causing higher levels of speciation in planets around the Thistle Nebula. From other bestiary entries, it can be inferred that the Thistle Nebula is where all of the moons we play on throughout the game are located. But here we get the first mention of mutations causing higher levels of speciation, or in other words, things to develop much faster than they otherwise would. And once you hear the shark comparison, you can kind of see it on the thumper, the way that its head and eyes are shaped and colored. But if this land shark doesn't make the connection for you clear enough, then the next entry, the bunker spider, will make it very clear. Bunker spiders are the classic horror staple of a giant spider enemy type. Similar to the thumper, you can kill them, but good luck. The bunker spider may not be as fast as the thumper is in a dead sprint, but what the bunker spider has over the thumper is an ambush attack, as bunker spiders will wait on the walls or ceilings of interiors before it jumps the player as they pass by. Now, there are ways for players to detect a bunker spider before they're attacked. For one, the bunker spider lays out several webs in the area that it's nesting. So if you see a bunch of spider webs on the inside of a building, that probably means there's a giant spider nearby. The player also has unlimited access to something called an echo scan. If you simply right-click the mouse, it will throw out a scan of the environment around you as you move along, which is very helpful at picking up loot. But also, if there's hidden creatures like snare fleas or bunker spiders, they can pop up on your scan before you even see them. If a bunker spider kills a player, it will web them up in a cocoon and then bring them back to its lair or just plant the body somewhere in the facility. Anytime a player dies in a facility and their body isn't recovered, it costs a pretty hefty fine. So it's normally a good idea to try to bring dead crewmates' bodies back to the ship. However, if someone has been cocooned by a bunker spider, someone has to come along and hit the body with a shovel or road sign before the cocooned body can be removed from the web and then carried back to the ship. But keep in mind, doing this will alert the nearby bunker spider if you haven't killed it yet. I should also add that Zeekers, in a more recent update to the game, allowed for an arachnophobia mode, meaning if you're scared of spiders, you can turn this mode on, and the spiders will still be on the map, but instead of their entire, 8-legged detail, it will now just be the word spider floating in air. So you still have to kill and deal with the word spider, but it is merely the concept of a spider rather than the spider itself. Now, while the bunker spider itself may seem like a kind of basic horror video game creature to deal with, it is the bestiary entry for it that opens up a whole can of worms. For one, the bestiary entry says that the bunker spider is of the genus Theraphosa, which in the real world, again, is a genus of spider. One terrifying note from the bestiary says that the bunker spider is the largest arachnid ever found in the Thistle Nebula and the second largest ever discovered, implying that there's something bigger than it out there in space somewhere. It also, once again, points towards the breadth of humanity, that the Thistle Nebula is just one of potentially many nebulas that humanity has ventured into. However, it is the sentences following this that raise a ton of questions about the lore of this game. That is, it's believed they evolved to prey on large mammals over the course of a measly several hundred years after the boat made its trip around the Thistle Nebula. What? Okay, so the boat, this is the first and one of the only mentions anywhere in the lore that we get of the boat. Pops up later on, but at the time that this bestiary entry was found, this was a game changer. For one, we have that first mention that the spider developed over the course of a measly several hundred years, which, yes, makes sense. From what we know in science, speciation takes a really long time. Even for selective traits to be bred in or bred out of a species, it can take generations and generations that span a millennia. Sure, smaller changes like bird beaks or wing shape can be studied over a person's lifetime, but a spider going from the sizes we know them to the sizes they're seen in the game is unheard of. But according to the bestiary, it happened over a measly several hundred years. And it happened after the boat made its trip around the nebula. We'll talk more about the implications of what the boat could be later on in the video, but for now I'll go ahead and say it seems that the monsters we run into, at least the biological ones within Lethal Company, are the result of rapid evolution to Earth species. Similar to how the spore lizard came from alligators or the thumper came from sharks. Something about these far-off moons caused species to develop way faster than they ever have been seen to develop on Earth. And apparently this boat was the inciting incident of that, but we'll get to it later. All you need to think about for now is that all of the horrors we're seeing come from our own planet. And at the very least, if there is some alien species or some other civilization that did not originate from Earth, we haven't seen it yet. The final lines of the bunker spider's bestiary are interesting as well, where it says, bunker spiders can pose a great danger to humans and urban explorers especially, without a great benefit to their ecosystems. A resulting kill-on-sight order has been informally agreed upon between many states home to the bunker spider, and it is currently approved by the ITDA as of 10/6/1965. Okay, so first of all, the year of 1965 is another whole thing I'll talk about in a minute. What I want to focus on now is the many states mentioned that house the bunker spider. Species like this are so known across the galaxy that there is a order of operations to be conducted when encountering one, in this case a kill on sight order. And there's also the mention of the ITDA. They only pop up one other time in the lore of the game, and they are called the ITDA. So at the time of recording, we don't know what that stands for or exactly what this organization is, but all we need to know for now is that there are letter agencies that exist among the stars that do things like regulate behavior around giant spiders. Again, it is more clues to this massive, massive world that has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years among the stars, and in cases like the moons we visit, have since gone extinct. Another creature you'll probably run into in the early game interior is something that, at least compared to the spider and thumper, is less aggressive most of the time, is something known as the hoarding bug. The hoarding bug is this little cricket roach looking creature thing that walks around on a couple of legs and will just kind of rotate around the area it originally spawns in. And if it runs into a player, it will typically stare at them, or if you're too close for a while, throw its hands up. But most of the time, you don't have to worry about them. But the hoarding bug gets their name for a reason, because while you, the player, and your friends are looking for scrap throughout these facilities, the hoarding bug is also doing that. It'll walk around, find random loot items, and carry them over to its nest, where it will just kind of sit by them. If you, the player, are foolish enough to try to pick up loot that you find on the ground, you know, the object of the game, that this hoarding bug so happens to be accustomed to, it will immediately lose its mind. The hoarding bug will change form and begin to fly and stretch out its body and fly back and forth into the player, striking it as it passes. Now, most of the time there is an easy solution to this. You can simply drop the item you're holding and run away, and typically the hoarding bug will lose interest in you. Or if you and your friends have shovels or stop signs, they're not that hard to kill, it just takes a few well-placed hits. However, where they become a problem is when there's a lot of them, because sometimes hoarding bugs will not spawn 1 or 2 at a time, they will spawn like 5 or 7 at a time. Moons with the hoarding bug have like a 2.9% chance to spawn something called an infestation, where there is just a ton of hoarding bugs all over the place wherever you go. So randomly, they'll decide that the loot you're on your way for is now their loot, and if you touch it, good luck. Because it's one thing to have one giant 3-foot tall bug flying trying to attack you, it's another to have 12. Most of the time what this results in is you walking up, seeing a rubber ducky on the ground, hearing it for a few frames, hearing a bunch of bug wings take off into the air, and then you're dead. Hoarding bugs can also decide that loot you've already picked up and dropped off is loot that they want to have. And this becomes a problem, as a common strategy for players is to group up all the loot they find at the front of the facility. Without later game upgrades like the fanny pack, players can only hold 4 items on them at a time. So what most players will do is they'll walk through the facility, gather up loot, and then drop it off in groups of 4 at the front door. And then whenever they're ready to travel back to the ship and drop off their loot, they'll just make a few trips back and forth. Well, the hoarding bug throws a wrench in that plan, because if you throw down your stuff at the front door, they'll just randomly come pick it up. And if you try to get it back, the whole bug mob attack thing may happen to you. Because of that, a lot of players will change their strategy to when they dump off stuff at the front of the facility, they will do it not inside, but outside the front door. Which is fine most of the time, but sometimes there's also things outside that want to kill you, which we'll talk about in a minute. The hoarding bug is a really good example of how the game, or Zeekers I should say, is able to build certain enemy types off of other enemy types. In some cases, it's more obvious, because you'll have creatures that are only able to see, and you'll have other creatures that are only able to hear. Meaning that while they can be easy to reconcile on their own, when paired together, you're going to have a bad time. But the hoarding bug creates these more nuanced hiccups in the game. Just by having the little change that hoarding bugs can randomly pick up loot and decide that it's theirs, it now makes players stash their allotted items on the outside of facilities. And that little change means that now they don't just have to contend with everything that can spawn on the inside, but they're forced to make their stockpile with things that can spawn on the outside. It's little touches like that that allow the game to have so many different dynamics playing off of each other at once. And of course, the bestiary says that hoarding bugs are of the order Hymenoptera, which in the real world is the order that contains things like wasps, ants, and other annoying large groups of insects. I know people make memes about the hoarding bug all the time. I know that people think they're really cute, and I know that there's mods for it that will make it say like, all my fellows, when they throw their hands up and stuff like that, and people think they're adorable. I see through their lines and need them genocided immediately. Especially because every time you die, you're not allowed to talk to the rest of your team until you come back to life. So what always happens is you die in the facility, and then you have to wait to the next round to explain to everyone why you died. And when you tell them that you died to a hoarding bug, they all laugh and think you're stupid when they didn't see the horde of 15 giant cockroach things fly at me at once that made me very scared. And yeah, okay, yeah, the blob. The blob's the other thing that can be found in the facility. Let's talk about that one. I know that there are more creatures that can spawn inside of the facility interiors, but the last one I'm going to talk about for now is the Hygrodeer. The Hygrodeer, most commonly called the blob by players, is effectively the blob from the movie The Blob. It is effectively a giant, slow-moving cell that devours anything that touches it. Death with the blob isn't instantaneous, but it's pretty close. If you're like trying to jump around one and you just barely catch it as you hop by, you'll take damage, but you won't die. If you're standing in the center of one, you're pretty much dead. The bestiary says that it's of the paraphyletic group Prostida, which in the real world is a type of eukaryotic cell. The bestiary also clarifies that this isn't one giant cell, but instead a massive colony of millions and billions, and I guess trillions, of other cells. Now, if you're deep within a facility and run into one of these things, it's normally not a problem unless it's blocking a doorway, and even then you just have to bait it around the edges of the room so that you can get out of that doorway. Also, most other entities in the game are able to open doors that you shut in front of them, but blobs are not able to open doors, more than likely on account of them not having limbs. So if you're in a facility and you see one and you can manage to jump around it, you can just shut the door and you're fine as long as nothing else comes through that area and opens the door for it. However, the reason they become a problem is because of their tracking. So blobs always know where other players are, and they will just very slowly creep their way to wherever the nearest player is. And again, as long as you don't touch it, you're normally fine. Players rarely die to them unless they're running from something else and have to run into a blob to escape. However, the way their tracking works, if a player is not in the facility, it will go to wherever it last saw a player at, which is typically the front door. Meaning that if one player leaves and decides to not tell the rest of the team that there was a blob in the front room, everyone else will go to the main door, open it, and immediately die because they're standing in the middle of a blob. This usually means that if a blob makes its way to the entrance of a facility, that entrance is now cut off and everyone has to use the fire exit or vice versa. Also, whereas earlier I said that it's been patched that you can stand on railings to get away from creatures like thumpers, you can still do that to get away from blobs. So as long as you have like a slightly elevated area, you're probably fine. Another interesting strategy to get rid of the blob is that they really like music. One of the items that can be purchased in the game is a boombox, which is 99% of the time used to just troll your friends and play obnoxious music as you run through hallway. However, if a blob spawns in while someone is playing music, the blob will get faster as it is going towards the player that is playing the boombox, but will stop before it touches them, allowing the player to just leave the blob around. Then, if the player wants to go somewhere else and not have the blob follow, they can drop the boombox on the ground and the blob will stay where the boombox is at, and you've effectively kept it to that part of the map. I could make some draw or connection here about lore or story of the game, but honestly it's probably just a cool little addition by Zeekers that the giant blue blob thing likes music. However, one lore implication I will make about the blob is in how it kills players. So typically when a player dies, their body just kind of flops on the ground. Certain enemy types will have certain kind of kill functions. As mentioned earlier, when a spider kills a player, it wraps them up in a cocoon, and some other enemies we'll talk about in a bit mutilate the player's body in various ways. Well, when a blob kills a player, it effectively dissolves them from the inside out. Their suit, all of the synthetic material of the player, is still intact, but it is now just a empty ragdoll of a suit, implying that the person on the inside has been completely dissolved. For one, that's a pretty cool touch, but also the suit itself can be carried back to the ship or teleported back to the ship, the same as any other player. And that suit, now empty of the body inside of it, has the same value as any other way you retrieve a body from the moon. Now, while this almost certainly comes from a gameplay perspective, that it would be annoying if there was one creature that could kill you and there was no way to get a recovery for the body back, I think the lore implication stands up as well. The only thing that the company actually needs to have back when a player dies is the suit. The measly $5 that the suit sells for is all the company cares about. The person inside is quite literally worthless, but that'll matter more as we get into the company itself later in the video. Now, while this is the majority of the things inside of the facility that want to kill you, even in the early game, there's a lot of stuff outside of the facility that wants to kill you as well, because you didn't think it'd be that easy. Or maybe you did. I don't know. Who am I to judge? Now, there are a couple things outside that don't want to kill you all the time. One of those is the Roman locust, which is literally just like a patch of locusts that flies in the air, and then you run through them and they scatter, and that's all they do. They're more set dressing than anything. The other is the manticoil, which the bestiary says is descended from real-world corvids, or things like ravens. And they're pretty much just a four-winged bird that will fly away whenever you get close, and again, that's all they do. And that's it. That's the total list of things in the game that don't want to kill you. So now on to the things that do want to kill you. The tulip snake by itself isn't explicitly harmful. Tulip snakes are these big bird flower looking things that will run at the player and jump on their head, and then for about 10 seconds try to fly away while holding the player. If one gets onto you, it's just a nuisance for 10 seconds. They'll flap their wings and they'll look down at you from the top of the screen and just do that for a little bit before they get bored and take off. However, if 2 tulip snakes or more get a hold of you at once, you will start to fly. Now, if you're good at the game and know how the jetpack controls, which is a device you'll get later into the game with money, you can kind of maneuver 2 tulip snakes to your benefit to get to your ship quicker, get to the front door quicker. But if you're not familiar with the game, what happens most often is they take you really high into the air, then they drop you and you die. Again, this doesn't explicitly kill you, but it can, because if you walk into the front door of a facility entrance and 2 tulip snakes are on you, there is a giant rotating fan at the top of the threshold in the front door, which they will fly you directly into and you will die. One on its own can also be a problem, because even though it can't get you to fly away, it will make a lot of noise while it's attached to the top of your head. That is very bad considering some of the other things that can spawn outside, like the blind dog. Despite being called the blind dog or the eyeless dog, these dogs seem to be more closely aligned to something like a lion than a canine. Their most striking detail is the giant fanged mouth at the front of their face that will kill you instantaneously if you come into contact with it. As the name implies, eyeless dogs are blind, but they have a very good sense of hearing that can pick up on footsteps, picking up items, or speaking to other players. They typically spawn more into the later evening hours as the day progresses. Every time you land on a planet, you land in the morning, but then there is a quick day to night cycle, so the quicker you can get all your stuff to the ship, the better, so you don't have to contend with these guys as you're getting your gear back to the ship. If a blind dog is encountered by itself and you know what you're doing, it's not that much to be afraid of. All you have to do is crouch and stay out of its immediate vicinity, because even if it is blind, if you run into it, it will still attack you. However, it's when you combine the blind dog with other creatures in the game that they become a real threat. Say, for example, you are doing fine to crouch and make your way back to the ship, but then a tulip snake jumps on your head. Well, now there's no use in staying quiet because that thing's going to make noise for 10 seconds, so you need to try to run, but in a dead sprint, an eyeless dog will beat you. So you have to figure out how to maneuver around obstacles or to try to strafe it out and jump over it and get really clever fast. The blind dog is also dangerous because it's one of the few entities that can just come directly onto the ship. So even if you have someone watching the control panel, manning things like the teleporter back on the ship, they still need to be quiet if a blind dog passes. This can create interesting scenarios where someone on the ship is acting as a mission control with a radio telling players on the ground that they are watching through the map system where to go. But then if a blind dog gets near the ship, the radio operator now has to be quiet. This quiet can lead people in the facility to think that their radio operator has been killed because they have to shut up for as long as the blind dog is around. There is a door at the back of the ship you can shut in the case of emergencies, but in very Five Nights at Freddy's fashion, the door can only be closed for so long before the power goes out, and it has to be reopened to recharge power, meaning it's not a permanent solution. Players will also try to rearrange like the lockers and bunk beds and stuff like that inside of the ship to make a sort of maze for the blind dog to come through, making it less likely for them to wander up to the front of the ship. But nothing's really foolproof with these things. So the only real way for someone on the ship to communicate with players outside of the ship, if there's a blind dog nearby, is through a long-range transmitter that will display short text on screen for all the other players to see. I like how there's so many different conventions in the game that cause you to change up your strategy, but there's typically a counter in those scenarios. Goes to show how well thought out a lot of the game's mechanics are. Also, if you have a mechanical keyboard like I do, you have to be very careful, because if you press on the key fast enough and your mic picks it up, that will count as noise to the blind dog and it will kill you. The eyeless dog's arch enemy is the baboon hawk, which you will also come to be greatly annoyed by. Baboon hawks are effectively bullies. If you run into one on its own, it will probably keep its distance and just kind of run up at you and then run back. Like their name, baboon hawks are descended from real-world primates, so they act the way packs of monkeys do whenever they're confronted by a threat, running up, making a lot of noise, and then backing off. There's a commonly held myth within the Lethal Company community that yelling at baboon hawks will cause them to back off. And while that isn't really true, holding weapons and swinging them at them does seem to work. But normally, if it's a one-on-one deal, you don't have to worry about it. If there are more than one baboon hawks and you're alone, then it becomes something to worry about. Because if there's several baboon hawks, they'll kind of get the courage to run up and attack you before they dip back. So if you're like by yourself and there's 3 baboon hawks, they're definitely going to attack, and when they eventually do beat you to death, the last one will skewer you with its beak and then carry you back to its nest. Baboon hawk nests are indicated by these 3 spikes that randomly spawn on the map whenever baboon hawks spawn in. They'll also occasionally take loot over to those sites as well. You can kill eyeless dogs and baboon hawks, it just takes some coordination because, you know, it's not an immediate kill and they tend to fight back. The best thing you can hope to do if you have both of these guys spawn in is get them to fight each other. Because if you're trying to make your way silently around an eyeless dog, baboon hawks make a lot of noise, so the dog will probably locate them before it locates you. And packs of baboon hawks and eyeless dogs will fight and kill each other, which provides a great distraction for you to get out of there. With few exception, most enemies in the game don't drop anything when you kill them, so normally it's not a game, unless you're just doing it for fun, to see how many things you can wipe out. It's just getting the loot that you found in the facility and getting out of there. However, there are some things that you will run into in game that cannot be killed, like the Earth Leviathan. The Earth Leviathan is effectively the giant sandworm from Dune. Like, it's the exact thing, a giant worm with a really big mouth that kills anything it runs into. The bestiary says they're descended from the Piscicaldae family on Earth, which is a group of things that contain animals like leeches. And the bestiary also hauntingly says that they are one of the largest invertebrates in the Thistle Nebula, implying that there are things even bigger than it. These are far and away the biggest creatures we've encountered so far. Well, except for the creature at the company, perhaps. So Earth Leviathans do not randomly roam around the map like a lot of other enemies. Instead, they roam underneath the map, and then when they attack, like a dolphin jumping out of the water, they do a huge jump from the area they started all the way to the outskirts of the map. These things are so big and only above ground for such a short amount of time and are impossible to kill. The only way that you can deal with an Earth Leviathan is by avoiding it. Whenever the Earth Leviathan is about to strike, you will hear its sound cue and see this kind of black particle effect float up around the area it's about to jump from. The implication being that the worm is quickly burrowing from underground up to that spot. Depending on what edge of the circle you're on whenever the effect starts, sometimes it's more useful to run to the sides or straight out, but most of the time it's most useful to turn around completely and run straight out the direction you were walking. Earth Leviathans do not discriminate either. They will kill anything that steps into their ring of death. Eyeless dogs, baboon hawks, you name it. They will most often spawn on like desert, arid planets, places like Assurance, but have a chance to spawn pretty much anywhere. Meaning that while you may be really good at dealing with creatures like eyeless dogs, you always have to have the possibility of an Earth Leviathan in the back of your mind. The Earth Leviathan also does a couple things for the lore. For one, the idea of a leech growing that big in any fathomable amount of time is absurd to imagine, so it points towards the greater implications of the Thistle Nebula making things evolve really quickly. The other detail about them is that they have the word Earth in their name. There's been some theories that Lethal Company is sort of like a Star Wars universe. The idea that it is things that look like humans, sure, but it is in a far off distant galaxy that Earth isn't a part of. But things within the ship's terminal being called Earth Leviathan implies that Earth is a part of this people's existence, giving us the idea that this is some group far off into the future that originated from where we're at now. And obviously this is supported by all of the animals being descendants from real-world creatures. This is just confirmation that Earth is still remembered in some small way. There's also another entity you can run into outdoors called circuit bees. Circuit bees are effectively giant swarms of bees around a hive. And the hive is worth a lot of money, but the problem is all of the bees on the hive. Circuit bees are descended from real-world bees and act the same as bees for the most part, except for the fact that as they fly in the air, they produce electricity. All this to say, you're going to die to them very quickly if you stay near the hive. But since the hive's worth a lot of money, you can do a strategy with another player, where one player runs up to the hive and gets the swarm's attention, while the other player picks up the hive and runs with it towards the ship. The hive can be dropped and the process reset as many times as needed. The one thing I will say is, for the love of all that's good, do not put the hive on the ship. The number of random lobbies I get in where they get the hive and they think it's a good idea to throw it at the entryway to the ship, and it kills everyone who tries to walk back onto the ship. What you do is you set the hive on the rail outside one of the doors to the ship, preferably the railing that you're not using. Then when the ship takes off at the end of the match, it will take the hive with it and leave the swarm behind, meaning you have a short window to walk out on the railing, pick up the hive without any bees on it, carry it into the ship, and get the money. Sometimes people will also just troll you for no reason, and they'll go pick up the hive and set it where they know players are going to be, like the front door, because they think it's funny to watch them suffer. Also, this isn't important to anyone but me, but if you're ever playing public lobbies of Lethal Company and you run into someone named RT is Daddy, all one word, capital R, capital T, kick him immediately. I was playing in public lobbies to try to get footage for this video, and then he comes along and spends all of the money we had saved up on random stuff and uses it to buy things like flashbangs that he throws on the ground just to blind us. And then when he got bored, he decided to wait till we all left the ship, take off the ship himself, and then leave the match, meaning the game thought everyone had died and we lost everything we had earned. This is the only retribution I have in any way that if you see this guy, make his game experience miserable. Thank you. Those are most of the creatures that you'll see on the interior and exterior of a facility setting. I know that there are a couple more I am purposefully forgetting to mention, but I'm saving them for dramatic effect at the end. Before we get to those, I want to move on to another kind of interior, the one that was most recently added to the game, that you are likely to see in some of these easy and intermediate game moons. And that is the mineshaft. The mineshaft is the most recent interior added to the game, and in my opinion, the most terrifying. When you come into the main entrance and the map has been spawned as a mineshaft, the only way to get to the rest of the map is through an elevator. This is a very small elevator that you can still manage to fit all 4 players in, and works as an easy location to leave your loot in as you are raiding the shaft. The elevator is small, but big enough to fit all 4 players, and works as an easy point to drop off your loot at as you are scavenging throughout the mineshaft. However, unlike facilities, mineshafts will typically be far more absent of light than other structures. For one, the actual mining areas that are full, again, of concrete walls and deep chasms tend to have a few lights tucked into the top corners of the room. And most of the hallways you'll come across are just long straightaways that will contain mine tracks and mine carts. But the real loot to be found in mine shafts are within the caves themselves. Cave entrances will be indicated by the standard yellow door you see throughout the mineshaft interior, will contain a blue light glowing on top of the door. And these caves always give way to a very long and deep maze that, if you don't know what you're doing, is very easy to get lost in. A lot of these will wind and cut back on themselves and lead to layers up and down that make it very easy to get confused, especially if you're trying to communicate to other players with proximity chat who may sound close but be on the other side of a cave wall, which could take a very long way to loop yourself back to. If that wasn't bad enough, a lot of these caves will have their means of progression cut off unless you travel underwater. You have to duck down underwater and go through these tight corners before coming up in another part of the cave, which for one makes backtracking more difficult, especially when you're burdened by a lot of loot. and if you stay underwater too long, you guessed it, you drown. In the early game, a lot of players will rely on flashlights to, see around dark areas. But after you've played the game for a while, you can probably get by on navigating dark areas just by using your scanner, because it kind of gives you a 3D layout of an area even if there's no light. However, mine shafts are a place where even experienced players would probably like a light of some kind, because since all of the geometry is the same and loops around itself, it is very easy to get lost. And another entity type that comes along with the mine shaft, and again, it can spawn anywhere else, but it seems most accustomed, at least according to its bestiary, to be in mine shafts, is the Maneater. So when you see the Maneater for the first time, it is very misleading. The Maneater at first is this really cute bug, grub looking thing that the first time it sees a player will become bonded to that player and start to follow them around. Periodically, while the Maneater is following a player, it will begin to cry, and you can get it to stop by picking it up and rocking it like a baby. At first, this is really cute because it's like you have a little buddy in your group now that needs to be taken care of, and most players will, joke about taking care of the child or who's holding the baby, stuff like that. It also seems that the Maneater gets stressed out if you rock it too much or if it gets scared. Seeing things like another player get killed or a player's body will cause it to get sad and cry. However, if the Maneater cries for too long and no one is there to comfort it, or even if you are comforting it, but the total sum time of its crying gets to be too much, you will quickly find out why it is called a Maneater. Because the Maneater will instantly transform into one of the worst things that can possibly happen to you, especially in a mine shaft. It grows into this giant, 8-limbed thing that chases you around corners and instantly kills you if it comes into contact. These Maneaters can also be deceptive. They will do things like mimic the sound that they make as a baby when they cry in order to lure players to them. So imagine that you leave one person in the mine shaft to take care of the Maneater, and then the Maneater transforms and kills the player. Well, when another player comes down, because again, dead players can't talk to alive players, they'll hear the baby crying and go to check on it only to see that it is an adult Maneater, and then it'll kill them as well. It is possible to kill an adult Maneater, but it is very difficult. Also, you may say, well, I'll alleviate that by bringing the baby outside. But if you bring a baby Maneater outside, it will instantly begin crying and won't quit, so it will transform after enough time into an adult Maneater, and now you have to deal with one of those outside near the ship. This also becomes a problem if someone on the ship teleports a player who's holding a Maneater back to the ship, because now the Maneater is not only outside but very far from an exit and will almost definitely transform into an adult Maneater unless you have an inverse teleporter to send the player back in. This is another mechanic that plays well off of the game's devices. For example, whenever the person inside of the spaceship is viewing the radar, they may see a red dot or enemy type attached to a player. Typically, this would mean that maybe a snare flea fell on the player and they need to get out of the mine shaft right now. So the person at the control panel hits the teleport button, teleports the player to the ship, and the snare flea falls off. But unless you're communicating through radio from the ship's computer, it looks like someone holding a Maneater might be someone who has a snare flea attached to them. So the person who's teleporting thinks they're doing a good thing by bringing that player to the ship through the teleporter, only to now have an adult Maneater in the ship ready to kill everyone. It turns the Maneater from just a cute little thing that can become a monster into a sort of chore, because if you see one in a mine shaft, someone has to take care of it to prevent it from becoming an adult, because if it becomes an adult, everything becomes a lot more difficult. This also changes the way other behaviors are done. The Maneater baby will cry if players are too loud or if they make too much noise around it, so you have to constantly be aware of how the baby is feeling. Despite this adding a level of complexity to the game, I think it is a cool level of complexity, because if you know what you're doing, you can typically get all the way to the end of the run and just leave the Maneater in the interior before you leave. So it is manageable, but if you don't manage it, it becomes a problem. Another interesting thing about the Maneater is its incredibly in-depth bestiary entry. This has been something that Sigurd has done more and more frequently with recent updates, where he will elaborate more on the lore or the world before we investigate it in Lethal Company. And the bestiary entry for the Maneater is evidence of that. It opens by saying the Maneater has been linked to a genus of cockroaches known as Paraplaneta, which makes sense. All of the creatures we see in the game are evolved from real-world species, and the little grub kind of looks like a cockroach, right? Well, after that it says, it was first nicknamed by workers of the Caswella Mine, one of many copper mines along the asteroid belt of Lepus in 1951. The Caswella Mine had begun to languish since the end of wartime and would soon close after operating for 12 years. Working conditions had worsened long before the rumor of the Maneater had begun to spread, and as a result, it was not taken seriously by the higher-ups or media at the time. On June 23rd of that year, however, an eviscerated corpse was rescued from the lowest level of Caswella Mine. It was later identified as Brett Goldent, a senior mining operator. Autopsy recorded the death an accident resulting from faulty equipment. However, the story became a sensation, and the Maneater rose up as famous myth until 6 years later, when it would be first recorded in the Deep 57 cave expedition headed by Simon Goldent to put to rest the mystery of his father's death. This was a revelation to the scientific world, as it is now known as the largest troglobite cave-dwelling species. A creature of this size confined to underground caves was thought impossible. Simon Goldent, who had sought to disprove the myth, described his discovery as, quote, traumatic. Okay, a lot. We're given whole lore explanations as to this creature's existence, that it came from a legend within mines, and then the mines shut down, and then there were investigations into it. And keep in mind, this is all civilizations that are now extinct from what we can see. The year of 1936 is also interesting. So a lot of people will try to take the world of Lethal Company and they will talk about it as basically an alternate history of Earth, that sometime in like the 1700s or whatever, we developed space travel, which I don't really think makes a lot of sense because, again, that is way off the timeline of any technology we had then, especially considering that the world as we see it in-game is several hundred years removed from even that world, right? I think what makes the most sense to me is that it is several thousand years into the future, if not tens of thousands of years into the future, and that we simply developed a new calendar. Think about it, our definition of years is based on how long it takes the Earth to take a trip around the sun. Well, if humanity is in far-off galaxies and nebulas, then just operating off of Earth years would make a lot of sense. It seems that this 1936 is probably using some kind of intergalactic calendar. Now, that's not to say that 1 year in this intergalactic calendar can't just be based off the time that it takes for one Earth year, because if you did it that way, every planet or moon you visited would have a different year date based on that planet's revolution time. For the sake of ease, we can imagine that 1 year within Lethal Company is the same as 1 year on Earth, but that this is a new dating system far off into the future. We could even make it easy and say that perhaps year 0 was whenever humanity first left Earth or began to colonize other planets, which would make sense as several of the events that are described are several hundred years in the past, and giving us a couple thousand years makes enough of a cushion for that to happen. Now, speciation to this degree wouldn't have happened in that time, but it's also mentioned that rapid evolution occurs around things like the Thistle Nebula. So even though this entry says 1936, and the previous entry about the spiders mentions the 1960s, we can assume that it's not our 1960s, it's some far-off 1960s. Now that being said, it is also clear that the game takes a lot of references from real-world culture around that time period and then transports it over to the game. For one, a lot of the posters that can be seen in the ship certainly elicit old 1960s and 1970s like propaganda or media from the time. One of the coolest upgrades you can get later in the game is something called the Company Cruiser, which is a giant truck that allows getting supplies to and from the ship a lot easier. The Company Cruiser is also a very effective weapon to anything you'll run into outside, as it can kill pretty much every enemy type in the game except for a couple in one hit. Keep in mind the cruiser itself can also get damaged and blow up, which will kill you if you're inside of it. And because a lot of the terrain isn't exactly flat, it will probably get stuck a lot, but you can get out and push it if that happens. I bring it up now because the Company Cruiser has a radio in it, and all of the songs that can be played on the radio are songs from 1920s and 1930s history in our world. So I think a lot of the ties between like 20s and 50s and 60s and stuff like that are more for an aesthetic choice to give the world of Lethal Company this kind of lost era feeling. But I think this 1900s is far separated from many 1900s of ours. However, there's another interesting note in that bestiary I want to mention, that all of this occurred post-war. And this starts to make a lot of things make sense. It's mentioned on moons like Experimentation that things there were built in secret. And a lot of the things that can kill you in facilities that I've neglected to mention up until this point are remnants of a war era. There are armed landmines and active turrets around a lot of corners in facilities, which if you step on or get in the way of, will kill you. Based on these things, it seems like a war ravaged a lot of the areas we experience in game. That can also help explain why so many of these locations are now abandoned. Why would you want to build a mining facility in secret? Probably if you were building up weapons or supplies against an enemy. Why would these facilities that you enter into be set up with landmines and turrets around every corner? Probably if you were worried about some invading force coming into that territory. And as mentioned, all of the creatures we've seen in this game are just variations of things that already existed on Earth. And as far as we know at the moment, there isn't any kind of alien life in the stars, at least none that we've ran into. So it seems that humanity was at the point that they weren't only building different civilizations and cultures, but these civilizations were big enough to have planetary war against one another. And again, that was far enough back that the war was over, and in post-wartime efforts, people were doing things like mining moons. I think the power just went out. It's kind of ominous, okay. Just keep this idea of a war in mind as we move on through the rest of the video, especially as we get into the other entities you can run into while playing. The third and final interior you can run into in the game, you can technically run into on the easy and intermediate maps, but they spawn much more often on the hard difficulty maps. The previous two makes a lot of sense. We have a facility, kind of an industrial living quarters, and we have a mine shaft, which makes sense because as we learned through the terminal, a lot of these planets were mined for their resources, or moons were mined for their resources. However, the third interior is interesting as it starkly stands out from the rest. That interior is a mansion. This is most often seen on the final 3 moons in the game, or at least not counting the secret moons, that being Rend, Dine, and Titan, with Rend and Dine having it as their most common type of interior to spawn. There is something incredibly uncanny about the mansion interior. Something about walking through these snow-covered, blizzard-ridden planets and opening a door to find yourself inside of a warmly lit library. And as opposed to the other 2 facilities, you can find pretty much every kind of living amenity inside of these structures. There's kitchen areas, there's fireplace areas, library bookshelves everywhere. And it gives us further insight to how the world of Lethal Company might have been built. Planets that could be used for resources and construction, places like desert planets that you could build industry on, or moons that could be mined for their resources, were turned into mine shafts. On planets where that wasn't feasible, places that were, say, covered in snow, were turned into living areas for the people who didn't have to be in the mines or factories. And it's such a stark juxtaposition between the dark gray walls and the metal flooring seen in the other spaces to come here and see wooden floors and grand staircases. The interior of random spawning hallways most often shows these massive bookshelves, information that contains millennia's worth of history for humanity as we know it now and humanity for the thousands of years between us and the world of Lethal Company. But in spite of the luxury and in spite of the level of security and comfort the people that lived here probably had, like everywhere else we go, it's abandoned. And it's here that we run into different kinds of creatures. Typically, all of the enemies that I've listed up until this point, aside from things like turrets and landmines, have been animalistic. They are evolved creatures that existed on Earth and became these kind of traps or nuisances as you work your way through facilities. But the creatures that we start to see when we get to areas like the mansion are much more mechanized and purposeful. And the first of these that I want to talk about is the coil heads. So coil heads have a high likelihood to spawn on like facility types as well, but they feel more at home with the creatures we see in mansion interiors. So coil heads are the classic enemy type that cannot move when you're looking at it. Think of these as the Weeping Angels from Doctor Who, or SCP-173. If you're not looking at it, it moves really fast towards the player, but as long as you're staring at it, it is completely still. The coil heads are also one of the few enemies in the game that cannot be killed. You can stun them temporarily with weapons like the flashbang or the stun gun, but you cannot completely stop a coil head. If a coil head catches a player, it will remove their head and replace it with a spring coil, making the player's body match the coil head's form itself. Coil heads also create a lot of complications with other entities because there's some things that you need to either run really far away from or need to stare at very sparingly. But if a coil head's there, then it demands your attention as you have to look that direction, and if there's something that direction you shouldn't look at, then you're going to have a bad time. However, one of the most interesting things about coil heads is its mention in the bestiary, where it says, they have been known to combust into flames when being dissected or even deactivated, and they carry dangerously high levels of radioactive particles. Due to this and other reasons, it has been highly speculated they were created as biological weapons of war, although this has not been proven. So in whatever war this was, one side, if not both sides, were building things like coil heads to use as weapons. Can you imagine how terrifying that is? Like, some invading army just airdrops a bunch of creatures you have to stare at, or else they rip your head off. Also, the mention of biological weapons of war implies that there is some level of biology in them, which is something that we'll see with other mechanized foes as we continue through these kinds of entities. So humanity wasn't just to the point where they were having wars for each other and were colonizing far-off moons, but they were also using this adaptive biology to make weapons to use against one another. Again, with things like this, it's no wonder areas like mansions are abandoned, because you'd probably just have to drop a couple of these things and they would clear out entire planets in a week. Another creature that is in a much similar vein is the Nutcracker. So the Nutcracker looks like the stereotypical children's toy. The difference being it is holding a shotgun. That is not like a euphemism or a joke. It has a double-barreled shotgun that it uses to patrol the hallways, again most often of mansions. Nutcrackers will rotate on guard inside of an interior before it randomly stops. Its head lifts up, revealing a fleshy eye that comes out of the Nutcracker's mouth as it scans the area and then continues its patrol. Nutcrackers can be easy to get around if you know how to deal with them. If the Nutcracker is walking, as long as you don't run into it or try to attack it, it won't harm you. However, when it is doing its search and the eye is looking around, if you remain perfectly still, the Nutcracker won't notice you. However, if it catches sight of you at any point, standing still won't do anything, as it will continue to chase and attack you even if you remain still after that. As mentioned, the Nutcracker is holding a double-barreled shotgun, which it will shoot at you if it sees you. Or if you get too close, it will simply kick and instant kill you. If you can manage to kill the Nutcracker, which is very difficult to do, because it can only take damage whenever its eye is exposed, and it can deal damage to you way faster than you can deal damage to it. But if you manage to kill one, when it falls to the ground, you can take its shotgun, and the Nutcracker will always drop an additional 2 shotgun shells in addition to whatever was in the shotgun when it died. And the shotgun is an incredibly useful tool for killing other entities, including other Nutcrackers. You just have to be careful with it and always remember to put the safety on, because there's a chance that the shotgun can randomly go off when you do things like drop it on the ground. The bestiary for the Nutcracker is interesting, as all it says is, guardians of the house. They watch with one tireless eye, which only senses movement. It remembers the last creature it noticed, whether they are moving or not. So think about it this way, right? We have creatures like coil heads that will only move whenever they are not being looked at. And then we have creatures like Nutcrackers that randomly patrol, look around, and then continue on their patrol. While they don't attack each other in game, it seems to me, at least from my limited knowledge of the game and lore and stuff like that, that this seems like an offense and defense system. While we don't see them attack each other in game, it seems to me that one was built to counter the other. You have creatures like coil heads that, as the bestiary says, were made to be weapons of war. Then you have creatures like the Nutcracker that are given a gun and are said to be guardians of the house. Maybe creatures like the Nutcracker that randomly look around for threats in the area were countered with creatures like the coil head, things that hold perfectly still whenever they're being observed. The Nutcracker's one weakness. It seems that what we're seeing here is 2 different sides of the war. We have one side that was building these creatures to be guardians, and we have another side that was building creatures of offense. Now, it is very possible that the bestiary definition, calling them the guardians of the house, is just metaphorical, as we often find them in mansion interiors, and both of these could be made by the same side to carry out the same purpose. But I think there is a huge juxtaposition in their appearance. One is made bare bones, just a mannequin with a spring head that chases down people, and the other seems to have a lot of attention to detail to come off as non-threatening. I mean, it looks like a children's toy. And as a matter of fact, the Nutcracker isn't the only monster that looks like a children's toy, because next up we have the Jack-in-the-Box. The Jack-in-the-Box is one of the most annoying things and terrifying things that you will come across in the entire time you play Lethal Company. So when you first encounter a Jack-in-the-Box, or Jester as they're called, the Jester is just a box with a pair of arms and legs that follows you around. And in this state, it does absolutely nothing. It just follows you around. It's kind of funny and awkward looking. It may kind of block a doorway, but you can just jump on top of them and then like crouch to get out of the doorway it's blocking. The Jester in this state is completely non-threatening. And then it suddenly becomes the most threatening thing in the entire game all at once. That is because after a Jester has followed a group of players for long enough, it will begin to wind up. One of the arms will grab the crank to the music box and for 40 seconds play a Jack-in-the-Box theme. However, as the theme is playing, it gets more decayed and more amped up until eventually Jack-in-the-Box pops. And when it does, rather than a cute little clown coming out of the top of it, it is a giant skull covered in fleshy tendons that runs way, way faster than the player ever can. What this means is that if a player sees a Jester, the entire run now becomes a Jester run, because it changes the strategy for everything you do at that point moving forward. After a Jester has popped, it will know the location of every player who is currently in the interior. It will run them down, instantly kill them, give it a couple seconds, and then it will chase someone else. The only way that you can counter the Jester is to leave the facility. After a while, it will go back to its starting state, and then you can quickly dip in before it starts to wind up again. So instead of staying and exploring the facility, it then becomes locate the fire exits, get in, get some loot, and go out to the exit before you make the Jester upset again. The bestiary entry doesn't do a lot for us either, as it's just the guy who's riding it, as we'll get to in a little bit, freaking out over how terrifying this thing is, but he ends by saying, good luck, you know as much as us, we call it the Jester. So similar to the Nutcracker, there's not a lot known about it, but also similar to the Nutcracker, it is something designed to be a children's toy that kills things a lot very quickly. This creates a kind of haunting implication. We know these areas are abandoned and we know that people used to live here, and ideally families and large swaths of people used to live here, right? And then there are creatures that are designed, I mean, I guess it's possible to say the Jack-in-the-Box is an animal, like, you know, the way an eyeless dog would be, right? That it is a natural evolution of something, but to me it looks more like something that was designed, something that was made to look like an unassuming children's toy. So why would a future civilization design weapons that are appealing to children before it springs to life and kills them, unless their objective is to wipe out a lot of children, which is a depressing thought. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of entities in the game that do not have a bestiary entry that kind of drive this point home. One of them is the drama mask. For those that know the classic images of Greek tragedy and drama, the smiling face and the frowny face, it is a mask that can appear as one of those two faces, and if the player decides to put it on, it has a high likelihood of killing them. After the player is killed by the mask, they will become possessed by the mask, walking around with the mask on and killing other players they run into. Now, for those that know SCP stuff, this is literally SCP-35. It is the drama mask that when you wear it, it possesses your body. However, the drama mask creates some very interesting dynamics within gameplay. So the drama mask appears on the ground as any other loot you can pick up. You can pick it up and then sell it for money at the company store. And as long as you pick it up and just leave it in your inventory, the mask can never harm you. But if you pick up the mask and decide to left click to put the mask on, that's when it has a chance to attack. Players who are possessed by the mask will die and then walk around in their body with the mask on their face. This creates a terrifying occurrence when you haven't heard from your teammate in a while and you look down the hallway and see their silhouette standing there, and every time there is a moment of doubt in your head if that's them or if that's their body possessed by the mask. Now, there are some ways to remedy this. If players have callouts and they're making noise to each other as they constantly move through the facility, the mask can't make noises, so that rules that out. The masked players will sometimes do random movements to make it seem like they're another player, like they'll walk up to an item or they'll sprint and then stop and then rotate, trying to be human. However, masked entities are one of the few things in the game that can go from the interior to the exterior of a map back and forth as they wish. Meaning that even if you leave the facility, the mask can just leave too and then follow you back to the ship. It is possible to kill these things, but you have to be careful because at any point they can grab you and make you dead. There's also one really evil trick that Zeekers put in the game just to mess with the community. So remember how I said you can have someone sitting back on the ship manning the teleporter and watching the map to see when people need evac'd out? Well, the map itself is just blips on a radar, so you can't see a lot of detail around characters. In other words, they just look like little blue dots moving through the facility, and it's up to the person manning the teleporter if someone needs extracted or not. So players started to do this thing where if they did certain body movements on the radar, it was a signal for the person manning the teleporter to teleport them out. The most common one that people in this community started to do was to just stand still and spin in place. For anyone who's played online games, this is probably familiar. Like, in most games, if someone is standing there and they crouch and stand up over and over, that is the universal sign of, I want to befriend, I'm not trying to fight. So spinning in place was the universal sign for teleport me out. So Zeekers programmed the mask to randomly stand still and spin in place. And since there's no way to differentiate someone that's been killed and now possessed by a mask because it doesn't show a red blip on the radar from a regular player, the person manning the teleporter thinks that their buddy wants teleported out. They teleport him to the ship, and it's actually their corpse now possessed by a mask. The mask immediately kills the person manning the teleporter, meaning there is now a second masked entity, because anyone who's killed by the mask becomes a mask. And now those two masked entities are waiting to kill the unsuspecting players who make their way back to the ship. There's also mods that have been incorporated into the game where the mask will take things that the player recently said in the proximity chat and then echo them. So with the mod attached, the mask can also do callouts and sound like dead players, even though they're just possessing the player's body. The mask also has a chance to spawn into maps as an already dead crewmate. Without mods, the max number of people that can enter a map at one time is 4. So 4 people can arrive at a planet, and when they get there, there is a 5th body that is already possessed by the mask walking around. This creates some more interesting dynamic. Now, if you see a masked person, that might be your friend that's dead, or it might be a standalone entity, meaning every time you see one, you have to try to do a head count to see if your 4th guy is still alive. There are a couple ways to remedy this. For one, you can buy different cosmetic suits inside of the spaceship that let you put on different color codes, mostly for aesthetic purposes, but it has an actual in-game use here, as the masked entity will always spawn in the default orange jumpsuit. So you can just buy a green or purple jumpsuit and make everyone in the crew wear that color. That way, if you see an orange mask, you know immediately that it's not one of your guys. Another way to do this is an item that can be bought in the store as well is a can of spray paint. This is used as a sort of breadcrumb trail in the larger maps, where if you get lost or confused about where you're traveling, you can just spray paint the walls or ground to find your way back out. But it has a second purpose here, as you can spray down everyone in your crew, and then if a masked entity shows up and isn't wearing spray paint, you know it's not one of your guys that are dead, giving you an accurate head count of who's still up and allows you to keep strategizing. Again, just such expert ways that all of the different entities in the game play so well off of the game's mechanics. However, the super interesting lore implication to me, by the fact that a masked entity can spawn on its own without a crew body member to do it, is that means there are previous crews who have already been to these locations. Think about it, if you 4 are the only ones who land, and a 5th body wearing your orange jumpsuit is walking around, that means someone had to be here and be killed by the mask before you got here. So if that's true, how many other crew members, how many other of these company groups have already ventured into these areas and never came back? And while we don't know the exact means of how the mask exists, it's probably not biological, and it might be mechanical, but it might also be supernatural. Now, up until this point of the game, we haven't seen anything expressly supernatural. Sure, there might be some creatures that are beyond our understanding of biology or whatever, but that's explained by like evolution and speciation and stuff like that. This mask seemingly possesses you, so unless there is some really complicated form of mechanics or invention going on to do that, it seems to be a supernatural entity. And the reason I feel like I can say that is because of one confirmed supernatural entity in the game, the Ghost Girl. The Ghost Girl, similar to the Mask, cannot be scanned and does not have a bestiary entry. It is one of the rarest enemies you can run into in the game, and also one of the most difficult to deal with. Whenever a Ghost Girl spawns onto the map, it will pick a player at random. Whenever you're playing through the game, players will get different rankings based on how they performed on certain runs. So for example, the player that gets the most scrap is given the most valuable title, and the player that spins around the most and looks the most directions is given the most paranoid title. Most often, the Ghost Girl will cling to whoever is the most paranoid. The way the Ghost Girl works is very complicated, and there's a lot of in-depth looking you can do into how the AI works, but the easiest way to describe it is that she plays a game of hide and seek. The first time you see the Ghost Girl, she will appear at the back of a room or in a facility before she quickly disappears. This leads a lot of new players to the game to quite literally think they imagined it. She will then appear somewhere else randomly, waiting for a player to run into her, and after the player sees her again, she'll start to move around. Eventually, the Ghost Girl will begin skipping towards the player who she is haunting, and if the Ghost Girl makes contact with a player, their head explodes. Now, what's really interesting about the Ghost Girl is any player that is not being haunted, so everyone else can't see her. So you can have a player freaking out saying she's right there in the corner of the room, but no one else can see her. So if that guy gets killed by the Ghost Girl, he'll be standing there 1 minute and then his head will just explode before the Ghost Girl resets her cycle and picks another player to target. The only way a non-haunted player can see a Ghost Girl is if she appears outside, because similar to the Mask, the Ghost Girl can move in and out of the facility to chase whoever she's haunting, and it's then that she can be picked up on the ship's cameras and non-haunted players can see her. Similar to how if a Jester appears in a map, it now becomes a Jester run because you have to change strategy for how you approach the map. If a player becomes haunted, it becomes a Ghost Girl run for that player. Because every time you run into her, you essentially aggro her more, make her become more active. So it's a smart idea if someone sees a Ghost Girl to make them be the one who goes and mans the ship's cameras, leading to the least likelihood that they'll run into the Ghost Girl. But like I said, the Ghost Girl can also leave the facility, and it's effectively a ticking clock for how many times the haunted player sees her. There's no way to kill the Ghost Girl, there is no way to interact with her, to stop her. She is a completely invincible enemy within the game. But like I said, she also doesn't have a bestiary entry and can't be scanned, implying that, as the name suggests, she is a ghost. When a player becomes haunted, supernatural things will begin to happen around them. Lights will begin to flicker, they'll hear a girl giggling in the distance. It seems that the Ghost Girl is a stereotypical ghost. And most interestingly, if you think about it, the Ghost Girl is the only human we encounter in the entire game. Other players aside, we never run into a human outside of this setting. We see evidence of humans, we see their construction, we see writings, but we never see another human. And the one we do see is the ghost of one. So when you put all of that together, when you say there's creatures like jesters and nutcrackers that are designed to look like children's toys, but then kill you, and then in the remnants of these abandoned housing areas, the only people we run into are the ghost of children, not a very pleasant thought. Now the one caveat to this is if you spawn on a planet that has a pre-existing masked entity, or the mask has already possessed a dead employee's body, then that body is technically another person that you're running into. But as mentioned, as far as we know, that is just a corpse of another employee, not a living one. And I know that a ghost isn't technically living either, but it's active on its own volition. These maps are full of weapons of war, and the only people we see are the ghosts of what used to be. Now that being said, there are a couple more entities that spawn again within these mansion interiors most often that do have humanoid traits. Technically the coil head is kind of humanoid because it's, designed to look like a person, but that's clearly like an artificial mannequin. But there's one that kind of walks the ground between something natural and something mechanical, and that's the barber. The barber, also known as the clay surgeon, is a giant purple human shape with a massive pair of scissors. The barber will quite terrifyingly teleport or jump towards you, and if it gets close enough, snap its scissors and cut players in half. These were recently added to the game, and we know next to nothing about them. They are very childish in their appearance, from their name to their design, from the fact that as they jump, there's like a snare drum hit. So in my mind, they kind of fit in with things like the Jester and the Nutcracker as being these unassuming entities until they become hyper-violent. And the bestiary entry for the barber doesn't do us a lot of favors either, as it says, "I had a dream about the barber. One day he made me a wig because his scissors were too big." Again, this poem kind of falls in line with the whole theory that it is made, again, to be an unassuming or child thing like the Nutcracker or the Jester. As a matter of fact, the kind of poetry to how it's described is very similar to the Nutcracker's bestiary entry. So in my mind, it kind of makes sense if these were designed as some sort of weapon. But again, they're newer to the game and we don't know a ton about them for me to make any definitive conclusions on that. Something that I will make more definitive conclusions on is the other kind of humanoid entity that can appear in mansions, the butler. So when you first see the butler from a distance, you can almost be mistaken that it's a person. It seems to be wearing a suit, has a face and hair, and most of the time when players encounter it, will be sweeping around the interior of a mansion. Again, I believe they can appear outside of mansions, but they're most commonly seen within mansions. However, when you get too close to the butler, that's when the ruse starts to fall apart. Its body isn't shaped right. It's like kind of draped in a cylinder, and its face looks like a pile of skin. You can certainly see how there used to be a person there, and you can see how the suit that it is wearing was probably someone's suit at some point, but that's certainly not a person anymore. When the butler sees a player, it will begin nonchalantly sweeping in the area, but subtly continue to track the player through different rooms. As long as the player isn't alone, this will never change, and the butler will just kind of hover around where the player is. But if a player that is being followed by a butler is alone for, I believe, 12 seconds, it will put away the broom, pull out a knife, and begin to chase and stab the player. And then if that player runs into an area with more players, it will pull out the broom and act like nothing ever happened. It seems that the butler is trying to murder you in secret away from prying eyes. To the degree that if it stabs a player to death, it will even clean up the blood and move away from where the body was. Where it gets really interesting is what happens if you kill the butler. Again, with any entity in the game, this is hard to do unless you stun it or use a zap gun and have another player hit it with a shovel, but if you manage to kill a butler, it will quickly swell up and pop. You have to get away from this pop as it's happening because it will damage nearby players and throw them a considerable distance. But in the aftermath of where it popped, a swarm of what's known as masked hornets will appear. And these masked hornets will continue to follow players through the facility, similar to how the butler did, only these can't be killed, but it's kind of easier to outrun. What that means is that the butler is just a drape of skin designed to look like a person that in reality is a giant bag of hornets. After the butler dies, it will leave in its wake the suit that the butler was once wearing, or at least the pile of skin that was made to look like the butler was once wearing. This is, in my opinion, one of the coolest monsters in Lethal Company. Like, we're walking around in the remnants of where people used to be, and other than things like the ghost girl, there's normally not a sign of them. But then randomly, a swarm of hornets will, I guess, assemble people's skin and put on a suit in order to look unassuming so it can chase people around and stab them to death. That is so cool. In the bestiary entry, it says, "The smell is like rotten meat. It's so bad it puts Richard to shame. I hear flies buzzing around inside their bodies. Jess said she saw something crawl out of its eye socket and go back in." This is like classic body horror monsters. I love it so much. There also is a benefit to killing the butler other than just getting rid of it on the map, because when the butler dies, it will drop its knife. The knife can be picked up and is one of the most effective weapons you can use in the game. It does the same damage as the shovel, but it can be swung a lot quicker. Even though you can spam it to swing it a bunch, it only does damage, I think, every 0.4 or 0.45 seconds. But it weighs 0 pounds and is much more usable than things like the shovel. The other benefit to the knife is any other butler can be killed by it in a single hit. This makes sense because if the butler is effectively a giant skin balloon full of bees, then just popping it will cause it to die. But again, this is one of the only direct mentions we get of any kind of remnants of people left through the game. We have the bodies that can be possessed by Mast, we have the spirit of the ghost girl, and we have the skin that was left over that made the butler. We don't know exactly what happened on these moons, but we know that it was bad. Because of the remnants we're seeing, it seems that humanity was wiped out and their pieces used to build whatever we're coming across. And a lot of this seems to be the product of some kind of war, and there is another explicitly war-made entity in the game that sheds a ton of light on what may have happened here. And that is a rather new addition to the game, the Old Bird. So remember how I said, like, the Jester, if it spawns in an interior, the game now becomes a Jester game. And if someone's haunted by a ghost girl, that player now has to play to the ghost girl. If an old bird spawns on the exterior, because thankfully it can only spawn on exteriors, if an old bird spawns on an exterior when you land, it now becomes an old bird game. When the match starts out, the old bird will be dormant. It will be standing like a statue in whatever area it spawns. It then has random chances throughout the rest of the day to turn on at any point. Also, remember how I mentioned facility interiors will have an apparatus that runs the power? If you pull an apparatus at any point, that forces any outdoor old birds to then turn on. The old bird is a stereotypical super mech made for war. It has a giant spotlight for a head, these loudspeakers that blare noises to terrorize people. It has rocket boosters on its feet that it will use to fly around or go up in the air and land on players. And it has a series of rockets that it will fire at anyone it sees. If you're outside and there's an old bird, you don't have to worry about eyeless dogs or baboon hawks or anything like that, because if the old bird sees it, it will make them a memory. The old bird leads to some of the most terrifying gameplay you can run into, but where I'm interested about it is its lore. Because while other than the coil head, we don't get explicit mention that things like the Nutcracker were designed as weapons of war, the old bird is very explicit in its definition, not only in its design, but in its bestiary entry. The bestiary entry for the old bird reads as follows. The old bird is an autonomous, offensive weapon of war with a humanoid design. Measured at 19 feet tall and 11 feet wide, its two most defining visual features are the spotlight positioned on its head, capable of emitting 100,000 lumens, and the long-range acoustic device on its chest, sometimes referred to as a sound cannon. There are additional speakers on its shoulders used to broadcast sound a long distance. The old bird's left arm is a claw, and its right arm is a nozzle capable of both launching rocket-propelled grenades and torching at close range with a very hot flame. Old birds are one of the first extra-orbital weapons to be used and mass-produced. So there we get our definitive note that this was designed as a weapon for war, as an orbital weapon, it says. But then the following paragraph, similar to the paragraph mentioned in the Maneater, opens up so many ideas for the world of Lethal Company. The subject of who developed the old birds has been an intense debate since their first recorded appearance on December 18th of 2143, when over 50 old birds invaded the Anglan capital. This is considered one of the first major causes for the downfall of the Anglan Empire. The most commonly upheld theory takes into account the tension between the Anglan and Bomok military throughout the 2100s. However, nothing has been proven in the centuries since. The design of the old bird, down to the tempering of metals, appears intended to conceal its origin. It has been called the walking ransom letter. Old bird's legs function as rockets, which allows them to travel long distances and find targets efficiently. But the most likely reason this feature exists is to help them enter and land from orbit. The material and fuel old birds rely on is similar to those of passenger spacecraft from around 2130. Old birds land and stay at their target planet forever. Although they often have more than enough fuel for just one trip, no behavior has been found in their programming which suggests they could choose to migrate. Still, there are unverified accounts of old birds traveling autonomously to a new planet after hundreds of years of dormancy. Okay. So, Anglan capital, Bomok Empire, whatever. This is the only mention we get of it. I could make of that what you will. Like, all of these empires, and there were invasions. Someone sent 50 to a capital, which I could see how one could destroy an empire, much less 50. But someone developed these things in secret somehow, and then used them to attack other moons and colonies, but also they can be sent to a planet and be dormant for hundreds of years. So these things have been around for hundreds of years. It builds up so many questions about the empires, about the war. Perhaps all the remnants we're seeing are the remnants of the Anglan and the Bomok War. Perhaps one side built the coil heads and the other built the nutcrackers. Perhaps one side built both. Perhaps these conflicts are completely unrelated and there's been a series of skirmishes across space for thousands of years. Who knows? But if one side of a conflict wanted to mass exterminate the entire population of another side, sending a bunch of old birds to a planet seems to be an easy way to do that. However, the old bird entry just gives us even more lore to dig into Lethal Company's world. As it continues, the old bird was historically referred to as the A1 based off the codename it was given by the English military, the A16L31. In 2384, however, the song Old Birds, released as a cult hit by the post-punk project Under Remora, Just 3 years later, in his most famous work of the same name, street artist Land Erie depicted the automatons flying and landing between planets in an arrangement similar to a flock of geese. This is generally considered one of the most iconic and influential images of modern culture and solidified the modern nickname. In 2356, 5 Embryon was classified as condemned for the purposes of travel or settlement by the boat. Old birds were described by witness accounts as lining the horizon, though to this day they appear inoperative. There's a reasonable risk that many are still in sleep mode, so the planet will likely keep its status. The small moon was likely used as a testing ground for the old bird's flying and landing capabilities. Okay, so this throws our timeline way into the future. We were talking about 1930s, 1960s, and we now have mention of things that happened in 2384. But we have so much stuff here that there is an English military, whatever that means in the far reaches of space, that gives it the designation. But then we also have a mention that there's a song, Old Birds, made by a post-punk project called Under Remora. So we don't just have militaries and empires, we have art, we have culture developing in space. But we don't see any of that because everything we come across is desolate. And also, crucially, we get our second mention of the boat, the thing mentioned all the way back in the Bunker Spider entry. So the Bunker Spider entry made it out to be that when this boat passed the Thistle Nebula, that these bunker spiders grew to the size that they did. But now, hundreds of years later, we see that a planet is condemned for travel or settlement by the boat. This implies that the boat wasn't just a one-time thing, but is either a group or a still existing thing out there in space. However, the Old Bird entry leads us to another secret of Lethal Company's world as well, and that is with the mention of Embryon. The Old Bird entry is interesting for a couple reasons. For one, shortly after that entire description I read was put into the game, in an update, part of it was removed. Everything to do with the Anglin Empire or the Bomok Empire was cut out. And not in a way to say it was retconned or perhaps Zeeker's changed his mind. Instead, you can see where the entry starts and then it's suddenly cut off and jumps down to the rest of the description. It's almost as if the company or the terminal is censoring information we weren't supposed to see. And similarly, the planet Embryon that was mentioned at the end as being condemned by the boat is now a location we can travel to. There are 2 secret moons in the game that are not listed in the ship's terminal that you just have to type the name in for the ship to take you to. And one of these is Embryon. Similar to the hard level moons, you have to pay to go to Embryon, but out of the paid moons, Embryon is the cheapest, only costing 150 credits to land at. And yeah, you'll never want to go there. Like, I went there one time for footage for this video and I'm never doing it again. So when you land at Embryon, the entire surface is covered in deactivated old birds. And it is a really long trek to get from your ship to the front door and the fire exit, which is an equal distance away. The interior of Embryon is the same, random spawn chance as any other map, but it is the exterior full of old birds that make it interesting, because as mentioned earlier, as the day goes on, it is more and more likely for old birds to be activated. And because there are so many on the surface, what effectively happens every time you try to leave the facility is it turns into a match of helldivers, only you don't have a gun and are far more vulnerable. It is chaos, it is a nightmare, it is a challenge map, if there ever was one. However, in the info for this moon, we get some interesting history when it says, Embryon was discovered in just the last century. It appears to have been used as a testing ground for old birds long before it was officially discovered. As a result of this danger, its status has been marked as condemned. There are theories that a diverse geothermal ecosystem may be thriving within the vast cave network under Embryon's surface. So that raises some interesting points. As mentioned in the bestiary entry, it seems that Embryon was kind of a testing facility or a holding site for old birds. But now it's saying that it was discovered and seems to be, prior to the discovery, a place old birds were sent. So why is that the case? Like, does that mean there's information of moons and planets that have been lost to history? Does that mean whatever empire that was building here has either ceased to exist or weren't able to pass on the information that the moon even exists? How did a race, if it is the Bomok Empire or what have you, how did a group that powerful suddenly just vanish? And for further proof of this, look at the other secret moon hidden in the game. Do you remember all the way back when I was describing the moons and I talked about adamants, how there is a cabin underneath the bridge that contains the spray paint that says 68 art? This is the only hint we get to the other secret planet in the game, Artifice. Artifice cost 1,500 credits to land on, double what the second highest moon Titan cost. And Artifice, like Embryon, is incredibly difficult and only recommended for high-level players. Sure, there's a lot of loot you can get a hold of, but it is rarely worth it. However, as soon as you start to explore Artifice, it looks to be a sort of abandoned military facility. There are several abandoned warehouses out front that look like aircraft hangars or a medical bay. And again, due to the very high number of old birds, this seems to be a military outpost for whatever created these old birds. Or alternatively, a target that the old birds have since wiped out and they are now simply dormant. In the history of Artifice, it says, weapons and classified technology has been found at various sites on the surface, dating back at least 200 years. So again, more references to this lost war, several hundred years old, and as it seems, wiped out a lot of our information of the empires that were a part of it. Artifice is equally a nightmare. You've got to deal with Earth Leviathans and old birds left and right. On the bright side, the Earth Leviathans can eat the old birds, but you have to be real careful about how you time it. As mentioned earlier, not for the faint of heart. But once again, the question is raised, how did militaries and empires that have this much infrastructure just disappear? Why are we now, hundreds of years later, going to their remains to collect junk? Sure, you have weapons, things like coil heads or old birds that you could see wiping out a population effectively, but ideally, the other side of this space-faring group of people would have weapons they could counter with, but they seem to be gone as well. What happened to all of the people, the empires, and the groups that existed around this region? How did everyone disappear? Well, it's here that I want to propose a theory, and it's also the reason that I have left a couple of very common entities you'll run into in the game out of the story up until this point. So let's rewind a little bit and talk about one of the earliest enemies you will come across as you play Lethal Company, the Bracken. The Bracken is one of the most terrifying things you're going to run into in the early game. The Bracken works by targeting certain players and stalking them from the shadows, never attempting to get into your line of sight. If the Bracken is not disturbed, it will slowly creep its way up to lone players before it puts their hands in front of their face, snaps their necks, dragging their body back to its lair. Facility interiors have a chance to spawn a backrooms area, or effectively one room that looks like the inside of an office space. It seems that Zeekers just likes online horror culture with inclusions of things like SCP creatures like SCP-35 in the game. So it seems that having a backrooms room that can randomly spawn in a facility is just a sort of Easter egg. However, a lot of players will take to calling these rooms Bracken rooms because there is an urban legend in the community that if a backroom's interior spawns, that means a Bracken has also spawned somewhere on the map. And that more specifically, this Bracken room is its sort of nest. Now that doesn't seem to be true, it just seems to be an urban legend, but for one, it goes to show how interesting Lethal Company is, because there are entire urban legends about how certain AI models in the game even work. Regardless, Brackens will stalk players and can only be diverted if they're looked at. Sometimes if you quickly turn around, you'll catch a Bracken that was previously sneaking up on you. If you do see a Bracken, you have to glance at it to make it go away, but if you stare at it, it'll get aggressive, drop the ruse, and just charge you and kill you. Again, it can be killed, but it takes a lot of finesse. Or, stun grenades. When the Bracken is killed, it will curl up into a ball and then quickly dissolve. The Bracken creates these terrifying scenarios where your whole group can be walking in one direction and then you just hear a quick snap of one of the player's necks. That player goes silent and everyone turns around to see a Bracken quickly make its way around the corner while holding their friend's body. However, the reason I have held off talking about the Bracken up until this point is because of its implication. There are certainly creatures within the game that are humanoid to some degree, but they can be explained. Things like the coil head are just a mannequin or a device shaped to look like a person, maybe to be mistaken by one for a distance, but fails on closer inspection. Things like the butler are certainly made of human skin, but that's not actually human, it's a bag of wasps that look like a human and are also really cool. And then you have things like the ghost girl that are human, but clearly a dead and supernatural version of a human. But the Brackens are an animal that can be seen and killed, that look quite explicitly like a person. In the bestiary entry, it says, it is a bipedal vertebrate with skin the color and texture of a red beak. The name is coined for what appear to be leaves protruding from its upper spine. The purpose of these is believed to be for intimidation. However, not much is known about the species of Bracken behavior due to its elusiveness and low population. So not a lot's known about it, but it kind of looks like a person and exists in places where people definitely used to be. So hold that thought as we talk about the last entity you'll run into in the game, at least at the time of recording, the Forest Keeper. The Forest Keeper is called the Forest Keeper because it most often spawns in forest. Only brave comments on the Wendigoon channel. From a distance, if standing still, the Forest Keeper can almost be confused for a kind of tree. This kind of thing can happen a lot actually, considering they spawn on forest maps and typically only late at night when your visibility is lowered. Forest Keepers are more commonly recognized by the sound they make. They are giant 30-foot tall creatures that stomp the ground loudly as they walk through the woods. Forest Keepers are deaf, so any amount of noise will not alert them, but if they see you, they will stop, stare for a moment, before they quickly make their way over to you. If a Forest Keeper catches you, it will pick you up, put you into its mouth, and chomp you to pieces. It is a giant thing in the woods that eats people. What is more fun than that? This creates some horrifying scenarios where an entire group of people can be running from a Forest Keeper, and as everyone jumps into the ship, the last guy gets picked out of the door before you see blood rain down from where that person once was. You can technically kill them if you stun them and hit them enough. I think it takes like 30 shovel hits to put one down, so good luck with that. The most effective way to kill them is to use the aforementioned company cruiser and just run it into them, which is risky as the Forest Keeper, if you are still for too long, can just pick you out of the cockpit of the company cruiser and eat you. If you're in the woods and you see a Forest Keeper, the best thing to do is to break line of sight by going behind trees or hills as you make your way to the ship or facility entrance. The bestiary for the Forest Keeper shares some interesting insight. For one, it says their bodies bear markings on their front and back which mimic eyes. This trait is more helpful in their youth as they are not agile. Their skin is a unique, dense material which hardens further throughout their lives. The large spikes and bumps across their bodies form as a result of aging. So effectively, you have this giant thing that has these fake eyes on its body, even though it does have a good line of sight, and its skin is effectively wood, forming off into these branches and spikes. But then after that, we get a really interesting note where it says, it's been said Forest Keepers exhibit a curious behavior similar to that of a human child the age of 5 or 6. They will eat anything they find fascinating. Forest Keepers don't actually need to put anything into their mouths, and it's theorized their main source of energy is a process similar to photosynthesis. For one, that almost makes them more terrifying. They don't actually need to eat you, they just do it because they find it interesting. And the whole photosynthesis idea further points to the idea that they're effectively a sort of living tree. A tree, however, that looks very human. However, the most fascinating lore implication about the Forest Keeper, to me, comes at the very start of its bestiary entry, where it says, they're believed to share a common ancestor with Rapix folium. Rapix folium is the scientific name of the bracken, as mentioned in its bestiary entry. So that makes some sense if you think about it, right? Because the bracken is described as a creature that effectively has these like brambles growing out of its back. It's very plant-like in that regard. And the Forest Keeper is effectively a giant living tree, right? However, another thing that these two have in common is that they are both the most humanoid monsters we come across in the game. Sure, there's some creatures that have some humanoid aspects, like you could say, oh, well, the Thumper has arms, but that one's already been clarified as like an evolved shark. Both the bracken and Forest Keeper stand upright like a man and have arms and legs. And while there's certainly speciation to their environments, the bracken grows inside of these dark type facilities, so it becomes accustomed to the dark and grows more like a weed. And the Forest Keeper is outside. It is with the trees, so it grows wood and branches, most like a tree. But yet they still have features of a man, and it says they share a common ancestor, so what could that mean? Now, this is all theory, none of this is confirmed by the game, so bear with me. We know that humanity has existed for at the least a couple thousand years among the stars, long enough to have wars and then the impacts and fallout from wars. But regardless of all of that, all of these worlds seem empty. And we already have mention with things like the bunker spider that creatures in the Thistle Nebula evolve at a very rapid rate. And with creatures like the spore lizard, we see these symbiosis arrangements where one species gets with another species and create a new thing. Just like how the spore lizard was a sort of alligator, but now the spore on its tail has turned it into a whole new creature. There was a cut creature from the game known as the kidnapper fox, which I won't get into now because it's cut content, so Don't know how I feel about bringing up all of its lore stuff, but the design behind the Kidnapper Fox was that it growed in something called a vein shroud, and the shroud was its own unique plant, and the Kidnapper Fox had adapted to appear like that kind of plant, at least from a distance, and made their home inside of vein shrouds. So again, we have different kind of species kind of melding together to be one in this environment. And sure, while there's certainly enough technology and weapons of war to wipe out entire populations, that still doesn't explain why everyone's gone. Because even if one side completely wiped out the other, well, that side should be there, right? They supposedly conquested the land, they should be there to take it, but they're not. What if, just like how sharks, spiders, centipedes, leeches, everything else evolved to cataclysmic proportions over just a few thousand years, what if people did too? What if something in the air or the radiation from the area caused the people who colonized these planets to become something monstrous? Those who were trapped inside of these now unpowered facilities adapted over the years to become these Brackens, these dark creatures that have grown to the veins and the vines around them and become these things that now hunt people who visit the facility. What if people that were stuck outside became a part of the wildlife around them in the trees and developed skin much like a tree and are now these giant hulking creatures that roam through the woods, picking up out of curiosity and putting into their mouth anything that comes in their way? What if it was not only the monsters people ran into that resulted in their demise, but people became the monsters themselves? Now, that's not to say all human life throughout the entire galaxy is gone, just gone here on the moons that we're exploring. I mean, maybe that in itself was a weapon of war. Maybe one side, in a desperate attempt to win or to destroy the enemy, put out some kind of biological agent or accelerated evolution past what people could withstand. It could have been an attack, it could have just been a result of the environment around them, but either way, I think that the Bracken and Forest Keeper is proof that we do run into the humans that used to live here, not only in the skin of the butler or the apparition of the ghost girl, but in what people have now become. So that raises the question, why are we doing any of this, right? Like, we are hired by a company to go to these planets that, for all intents and purposes, should be nuked from orbit. If anyone who's living there becomes a monster, and all the stuff that exists on there are monsters, and the walls of these places are just full of junk, why are we even doing this? I mean, what do we do with this junk anyway? We pick it up, we bring it back to the ship, and we take it where, right? Well, if you've played the game, you know exactly where we take it, and you've probably been screaming at the screen since I started this video of why I'm not talking about the most common planet that a player will ever visit while they play Lethal Company. See, the way the game cycle works is you have 3 days to collect an amount of scrap to reach a set quota, and then you go to sell the scrap, and then the quota rises, and you do another 3 days and repeat the process. So at the interval of every 3 days, you have to go somewhere to sell the scrap. And it is where we go to sell that scrap that is the final moon within Lethal Company. And that moon is, quite fittingly, the company building. So every 3 days you will land at the company building. And the company building is the only moon in the game that doesn't have roaming enemies looking to kill you. I mean, you could certainly die there, but it won't be to stuff that's walking around on the outside near the ship trying to get rid of you. You land at the company building and it looks like a giant oil rig of sorts. The entire planet, at least as far as we can see, seems to be covered in water or some kind of ocean. And the landing platform that the ship lands on is a giant catwalk well above sea level. It is here that the players gather all of the scrap that they have found on other moons and bring it over to a sort of shop counter. After the players have placed all of the scrap that they have, or as much as the counter can hold, you ring a bell a few times and the door opens before a large hook extends from the dark interior, pulls all of the scrap in, and then after some calculating, the players are paid whatever the scrap was worth. This is how the main game's economy functions. You go to moons, collect scrap, sell it here, and then you use that money to buy some of the tools and items that I've mentioned throughout the video. So this seems to be the point of everything. Whatever the company is has us go to these far-off abandoned moons, gather scrap, give it to them, a hook pulls in the scrap, and then gives us money. The most defining feature about the company building is how large it is. When you look up to the sky, it seems like a near infinite wall of concrete. And you can walk a really far direction left and right, and it's just wall on wall on wall until the platform ends into nothingness. Whatever this company building is, it is huge. And for some reason, they want the junk that's been left behind on these now abandoned moons. However, if you get close to the wall or the counter where this large scythe reaches out of and pulls the scrap in, you can hear some really weird noises. You can hear things like gurgle or movement or some kind of commotion coming from something on the other side of this wall. And as any new player to Lethal Company knows, as their friend tells them the only way to sell scrap is to spam the bell as fast as they can, if you make too much noise or disrupt too much whatever's happening on the other side of the counter, instead of a scythe hand coming out to grab the scrap, giant red tentacles fly out and grab whatever player is standing closest before ripping them into the darkness. This tells us that right here on the other side of this wall, some gargantuan monster is waiting. Supposedly, the thing that all of this scrap is being delivered to. So the question is, why? Why does the company have a giant thing, tentacle, monster, whatever, on the other side of the concrete, and why are we risking our lives constantly to bring this thing pieces of junk metal or empty bottles? Well, if you just played the game and go through the moons, that is entirely left up to speculation. It is whatever you want it to be. But if you dig a little bit deeper, there is a story within the story of Lethal Company. Do you remember how at the beginning of the video I said that next to the ship's terminal there is a post-it note saying that we're in deep and to use the code Sigurd? Well, if you use that code, you get access to several audio logs that you can find throughout every moon in the game. As you're traveling on these moons, if you stray from the beaten path, going on top of structures or around the side of the building, there's a chance that you can come across these forgotten logs. And using Sigurd on the ship's terminal allows you to access and read those logs. And it seems that Sigurd was a member of another company crew much like your own, but far, far in the past. So by reading Sigurd's logs, we get a picture of what all this might really be about.
Hello, I am writing this log to keep myself sane. I couldn't find a way to do the most basic thing on this old janky butt computer, so I had Desmond added in, the log feature. Till now, I've just been adding my own notes to the bestiary whatever I know. My brother said I should keep a journal, so I'm doing what I can. I'm writing in a professional manner, as these logs could become a historical record, as they will probably be here for years, just as long as there isn't a clean wipe. That is what Desmond said. If you're reading it in the future, you are probably from another crew. The turnover rate here is enormous. Maybe because this job sucks and everyone turns over dead. Maybe I can give some help when I have some experience. In log. Oh, our names are Sigurd, me, Richard, Desmond, and Jess.
So here we get an introduction to Sigurd, as well as the rest of his crew, Richard, Desmond, and Jess. You probably remember those names because they were mentioned in the Butler bestiary entry. As a matter of fact, every bestiary entry in the game, to some degree, seems to have been edited by Sigurd. At the beginning of each bestiary entry, he gives his danger level for what a specific entity is. And most of the time, you can't trust him at all because he says things like the hoarding bugs aren't dangerous at all, which, as I talked about earlier, I hate them. But also that date of 1968 dates this well before a lot of the events we've talked about. We've talked about events all the way up to 2300. So Sigurd and his crew were doing this 300 years ago, at least. That also gives the implication that the company has been sending out people on these scrap runs, again, 300 years ago. So that further begs the question, why are we still doing it now? But more to come on that.
Gosh, this suit is squeezing me like I'm a gosh damn mummy. I'm a grown man. Give it some space between the legs. It's killing me. I'm dying. I hope you're happy, Dad. I finally got a job. Screw you. Everyone here smells. Especially Rich. I'm gonna throw him in the lake. I don't care what it's made of. I love being on camera duty. Oh, I forgot. The date. It's August 24th, 1968. This keyboard has just said you'll fast. Today we found a couple frying pans and a big nail. Worth almost nothing. What is the company even using it for?
Mostly just Sigurd complaining, but it points out that even that long ago, they were still finding the same things that we're finding now. Things like a big nail and frying pans.
We got in the swing of things the past few days. That's what Rich keeps saying. He smells like a rancid tuna can. Worst summer camp I've ever been on. Date is August 27th, 1968. We make sure someone always has a shovel for bashing anything that moves, and we always put someone on camera duty so they can open those big security doors with letters and numbers. Ask Desmond the wizard how that works. I think he just types in the code that's on the door. That's it. We sold some goods to the company today at 70% value. I got my nerves chilled listening to the psychotic sounds behind the counter. No one else gave any? Can't ignore that. My flashlight didn't even go back there. The beam just went dark.
For one, this establishes Desmond as being the tech guru or the guy who knows how the equipment works, but it also points out that Sigurd started to have the same questions that we have, that there's something on the other side of the company counter. And similar to us, when we try to see what's behind it, all we can see is darkness.
I talked to a voice on the walkie-talkie. It was like a part of the screams. He told me the golden planet actually existed. It's not a legend. And he told me it didn't just hit a meteor. He said the planet was swallowed up by the beast, and they were in its body being digested. I asked what the beast is, and he said he didn't know. He said it ate the planet, and they forgot everything. I couldn't get him to stop talking, but I said he was on the other side of a big wall, and I could get him out. I said he was inside the building, and that's when he started freaking out. I couldn't make out a word. I think he said something about spitting out the rinds, so I just turned it off. What a whack. Jess says the golden planet is just a story. I said I know, I'm not an idiot. Well, she said I should quit, and she quits if I do. So, she's staying.
Okay, a lot to unpack here. It seems from talking about the other side of the wall, Sigurd is also making this entry about being at the company building, and that this voice on the other end of the walkie-talkie sounds like it's coming from the other side of the building, that it is coming from where the screams are coming from, as Sigurd describes it. But the voice on the other end of this walkie-talkie says that they were a part of this golden planet and a beast came and ate them up. Quite interestingly, he says that the beast ate the planet and they forgot everything. Keep that quote too about spitting out the rinds in mind for later. Now, this golden planet is also something we're being introduced to, the idea of a golden planet in the stars that supposedly this beast ate.
Date is August 31st, 1968. I got my camera duty again. I hate walking on this moon anyway. Aha, joke's on them. It just started raining. I'm just sitting. Can't sleep on these tiny beds for ants. I've been thinking a lot. I think this job is shady. If you're reading this, you probably got here the same as me. The pay is good. The contract only lasts a season. They ran you through their assessment exam on the phone with a weird voice. You signed the contract on the shuttle with the rest of your crew. But the whole time you didn't talk to anyone. The shuttle was autopiloted. I think the voice on the phone was fake. I've had the worst dreams. I think I just want to go back home. But I'm not going to crawl home crying and scratching on Dad's front door. That's not his son. That's not Sigurd.
So this is also interesting. As mentioned, we never run into another person throughout the entire game unless you count the bodies and potentially evolved people, as I talked about earlier. And it seems that through the whole hiring and introduction process, that has been the same. It is an entirely autopiloted system to get people from one place to the other. It's almost like the entire company itself is some kind of automation. And we also have the mention that Sigurd himself refuses to quit the job because he can't stand to look at his father after having quit.
Date, September 4th, 1968. I got woken up early this morning because we were going to the company building to sell our useless garbage. The rate was 120%, which Desmond says is rare and he didn't want to miss it. He's been watching it like the stupid stocks. It still sucks here. Rich still smells like a piece of shit. I can barely sleep. I heard the worst sound behind the wall of the company building. It sounded like crying red faces all churned up and swept away by concrete, like the pestle and bowl my mom crushes up her seeds and spices in. I still hear it. It's a nightmare. No one else heard it. They don't know what to do. Jess thinks I'm homesick. No, I'm sick of this cheap suit.
This is another mention of whatever's on the other side of the wall sounding like people being churned up. If the entry mentioned earlier from the person from the golden planet, if he says that the beast ate them up and now he's on the other side of the wall, that would imply that whatever beast is on the other side of the company building wall, the thing that we're feeding scrap to, is the thing that eats planets, or at least the people on the planets. Now it is sitting behind this wall as people are slowly being digested and it's spitting out the rinds. And all that Sigurd's crew, and assumedly our crew, can do is keep feeding it.
We left behind Rich. We just had one room to check and then we could be done for the day. I couldn't get the door open. And then I looked and Rich wasn't there. It was the wrinkly skinned flower head man that walks on two legs. It turned his neck. I heard the crack, but he wasn't there. I wanted to find Rich even if he was dead, but they're cowards. Their faces are blank like idiots. There's nothing moving in their stupid skulls. All they wanted to do is leave. They were going to leave me too. We all hated Rich, but we didn't want this. This isn't worth it. It's just not worth it. We got a pair of scissors, a box full of stamps, and a bundle of cords to sell for nothing. It's not worth it. What does the company even want it for? The date we last saw Rich is September 7th, 1968.
So it seems that here, Rich died to a bracken, again something that will be commonly seen as you play the game. But it seems that this is causing Sigurd to be distressed, and he's starting to lose his mind over what the company's making him do.
Date September 13th, 1968. For some reason, I was the one who had to call the company number to report the accident. They were too scared to do it. It was the same fake voice I remember from the interview on the phone at home and the stupid training videos. But it heard what I said, I think, because it said they would contact the family and find a replacement and something else. It talked so fast. I learned you can hear the screams all the time in the walkie-talkie when you're at the wall of the company building. They didn't believe me. Well, now they do. It sounds just like when I heard it a couple weeks ago. They want to quit. I said I'm not a coward. I just got this job.
So similarly to previous mentions, the voice that you talk to, the company voice, just seems to be an automation. It's processing what you're saying, but there isn't actually another person on the end of the line that you're talking to. The mention that if you hold a walkie-talkie near the outside of the company building, you can hear screams seems to be exclusive to Sigurd's logs. Because there are walkie-talkies in the game, but if you seem to hold them up, at least in my testing, walking around the company building, you don't hear anything. I will say there is one device you can pick up, just a piece of junk called the old phone. And whenever you pull out the old phone, you'll hear something like a woman scream for a brief second before the line cuts. But you don't have to be standing at the company building to do that. That happens anywhere. It's quite possible that this was real at Sigurd's time and isn't real now, or that Sigurd is starting to lose his mind. Both viable options.
Date September 18th, 1968. The past weekend, it feels like Desmond and Jess woke up. We're supposed to get our fourth member of the crew in a few days. We aren't taking any risks anymore. We don't get as much, but it feels safer, and I've gotten better sleep. But it's still ass. I can still smell Rich. I swear to gosh, he smelled that bad. I was talking about how the voice on the phone sounded fake, and Desmond got this weird idea. He's the wizard and all, so he thinks there's a way to use the phone call I made to the company number to find out where the voice comes from. I don't know why he would want to do that, but he seems serious. He's been using the terminal a lot.
So now Sigurd's crew is thinking about a way out, thinking about a way to survive, and Desmond seems curious to figure out what everything means, to figure out what the company's up to.
September 27th, 1968. Desmond wants me to write down what we figured out and keep my, quote, nonsense to a minimum. So I'm going to put so much of my nonsense, screw him. The new crew member is named Lucas, and he is so confused and scared all the time. What a baby. At least he doesn't smell like a monster. It's been so sunny even though it's September, and these suits don't take it well. Okay, so Desmond traced the call and found out there's a group of people somewhere else that pretends to call us from the company building. They are across the whole solar system. Why would they be so far away? Desmond says he doesn't know, but I think. What if there really is a big monster in the company building like the voice told me on the walkie-talkie? They trapped it and we feed it to keep it tame. I just wanted a stupid job.
So for one, Sigurd is coming to the same conclusions we have. There's a monster in the company building and we're just feeding it. But the mention of Desmond tracing the call and it's on the other side of the solar system is super weird. Why would a company that is just feeding this beast for no reason be set up on the other side of the solar system? And why would there not be any real people there? It's all just automation to make sure employees keep doing their job of, again, feeding junk to a monster.
September 30th, 1968. I keep having bad dreams about the company building where the company breaks out of the giant concrete wall. But I don't know if it looks like anything. I just think it's really big and fast. We can't figure out a way to know if the voices on the phone are real. Desmond says it's too far away. I asked him if he could take control of the autopilot, and he said I'm crazy and that could kill us. Yes, I'm crazy, Desmond. He says we would have to get our own private flight to go to the coordinates, and who knows what would actually be there. So what if it's nothing? I started wondering how I can't remember how we really got here. No, I just remember little things like the shuttle flight to the building where we signed our contracts. But I don't remember getting on the shuttle. I don't even remember saying bye to Dad. In my dreams, it feels like the company isn't trapped in there at all. It's just hiding. I don't know if I'm going home.
So this one is interesting. For one, Sigurd is no longer referring to it as the monster in the company building. The monster and the company are now one and the same. And also, we have the kind of bizarre mention that Sigurd is losing his memories. Sigurd can't remember saying bye to his dad. He doesn't remember how he got there. Earlier, it was clear. He talked about the phone call, taking off on the shuttle autopiloted, but now everything seems foggy and strange. Keep that in mind as we move on to the next log.
Date, October 1st, 1968. We're out of snacks and lemonade packets again. Desmond thinks stun grenades are more beneficial. Well, if he puts off ordering my stuff for another day, I'm going to take a shit on the control lever and ask him what he thinks about his stun grenades then. Desmond, don't read this. I know I'm not the wizard, but I guess I'm the computer guy again today. Every time I go outside on Vow, they say I get pale like I'm dead. So they put me on screen duty. They think I got soft or something. Whatever. Lucas is the scared one. Good luck keeping him from losing his freaking mind. I could stroll out at night like it's my backyard. It's just that I saw Rich on a hill. He was over on the other side of the river, but that was 3 days ago. I'm not scared. It's just getting cold outside. I think they just want me to have screen duty every day, and they're all set on an excuse. I miss Dad. I hope he isn't staying on Titan. People are saying it's not going to look the same in 2 years. Jess told us they're about to go to war and everyone's waiting for it. Every time we go to sell, the company building is shaking like there's a loud furnace inside. They're too afraid to quit. We can barely sleep to meet the quota, and it gets worse every time. God, I feel like I'm being squeezed through a needle. I wish we could go back. It's better working for Dad even when I got nothing, just daily allowance. I liked when he would drive us out of town to see the waterfall and walked up those old wooden stairs. Just wanted a real job.
Now, we have a few interesting things here. The first one I want to mention is Rich. As we know, Rich is dead. He was killed by a bracken, right? But here, Sigurd mentions that he saw Rich. Now, this can be assumed to be paranoia or maybe even the ghost of a missing teammate. If nothing else, it's further evidence that Sigurd's mind is slipping. However, what is also interesting is the mention that Sigurd's dad lives on Titan and that things are about to get bad. And considering of what we see of Titan now, whenever we land there, that is an understatement. But at least at the time Sigurd's writing this, Titan seemed to be okay, and people were saying that a war was coming. Now, we kind of have evidence that there are a couple wars within the Lethal Company timeline. In the 1930s, when we talk about the mines with the Maneater, it says that these mines were developed in post-war era. And then after that, we have all the stuff that happened around 2100, I think, with the Old Birds between the Anglin and the Bomok Empire. Although that's not explicitly described as a war, it certainly is a militaristic takeover. And sure, while that might be the one that Sigurd is referring to, saying that Titan was getting prepared for whatever happened in the 2100s, that seems kind of odd. Because think about it, we had a war that existed before the 1930s. And then in 1960, Sigurd says that he's worried about his father because a war is about to happen, but it seems that a war doesn't happen for like another 150 years. And this is the last log that we get from Sigurd, because our last entry is simply this.
Desmond, October 15th, 1968. I'm encrypting these logs to keep them hidden, as I fear the system will be wiped if they are found. It's all a guise. We're supposed to think it's all just a transaction, but our real job is keeping an incredible terror fed. How long until its fullness ends and its hunger is insatiable? God knows. Maybe it has to do with all these desolate moons. Whoever reads this, I'm sorry to burden you with this. Please have a good day and night, as what else is there for us to do?
Now this makes sense. For one, Desmond is described as the tech guy, and he's the one who encrypted these logs and left the post-it note that allow us to read all of this. So it seemed that Sigurd's crew probably died somewhere back in the 1960s, and now we're here in their aftermath. Which begs the question, when are we here? Because there's mentions of 2200, 2300, 2100, 1930. What year does Lethal Company take place in? Well, whenever you boot up the terminal, you can see the current date, which on the first day that you play Lethal Company is July of 2532. Or in other words, about 563 years after Sigurd's crew. That is an absurd amount of time to be in the same spaceship doing the same job. Because this has to be the same ship that Sigurd and his crew were using, right? Because all the stuff's hidden on the terminal we use, and the post-it note was placed next to the terminal we used. Which, by the way, would mean that that post-it note has been there for 563 years. Unless, of course, it hasn't been. So as far as definitive lore goes, that's pretty much everything for the game. But I think there are enough pieces here to put together a theory. So remember how the voice in the Golden Planet entry said that they were on the Golden Planet, but then the monster ate them and they lost all their memories before the rinds are spit out? And remember how Sigurd can't remember how he got this job or his father or the other things that seemingly are just basic fact to him? And remember how everything to do with the company seems to be automated and coming from somewhere across the solar system? And remember how, aside from the bodies and the evolved, you never see another human? Not even your other teammates, not even yourself. What if the monster behind the company wall, or as Sigurd begins to refer to it, the company, has been eating people up and spitting out the rinds for centuries? What if this monster is more than just a monster? What if it is a thinking being that exists in many places across the solar system, or at least has the power to project itself? What if the monster eats people up, it mashes them, grinds them in a pestle, as Sigurd describes it, before it spits out their bodies into this mechanical suit, sending them out to go to planets and bring it more food to eat? The people who are eaten and digested by it lose their memories just as Sigurd is. And there seems to be no people operating the company. The company and the monster seem to be the same thing, so it's clearly the monster that wants us to feed it. Why would it need people to do that when it can spit out the rinds, as the voice on the walkie said? It's no wonder that employees' lives are so meaningless to the company, because it can simply make more. If this thing eats planets, it has a practically infinite amount of bodies to throw out into space to bring it food. This explains why we can go to planets and there's massed entities already existing there before we get there, because who knows how many of these things the company is throwing out. As the log mentions, there's no way walls can contain something that big. It's just there because it chooses to, or it's hiding. Perhaps hiding from all of these intergalactic groups of people that have weapons like old birds. Perhaps it's hiding because it's easier to just stay in one place and have these flesh puppets bring you your dinner. It seems that Sigurd and the rest of his crew have their memories entirely destroyed. Sigurd says in 1960 he is worried about his father on Titan for the war that's about to happen, and the only definitive war that we get ended before 1930. Perhaps Sigurd took this job sometime in the late 1800s, or perhaps he was on another planet, even the Golden Planet, before he was eaten by the beast and spit out. And now he has all these implanted memories and the timelines don't make sense and he's not sure what he's doing, but all he knows is that he has to keep feeding the beast. I mean, that would explain a lot of things. It would explain why you never see another member of the company without their suit on, covering every inch of their skin. It would explain why Sigurd talks about the suit being so tight and uncomfortable and that he can never take it off. Because if it was taken off, it would reveal people for the bag of bones they really are. That would even explain little things like why Rich constantly stinks or smells like death, as he says. That would explain why things like Butler seem to have a healthy supply of human skin in spite of all the people being dead for hundreds of years or evolved into something without skin. As the company uses mashed up corpses to do its bidding and projects messages from the other side of the galaxy, these used to be people think that they have some agency. The memories of what used to be float in their minds, and they think that they have some say in their life and their survival. But if you've played the game for any amount of time, you know that eventually it all ends the same way. The quota keeps going up, you keep dying, and you keep spawning back in exactly where you started. Another bag of bones set to feed a creature that is full of flesh. Much like how the employees of the company go through space collecting scrap of what used to be, they themselves are scraps of what they used to be. And I think there's evidence of this within the game, or at least there was evidence of this in the game. So looking at a timeline, we know that Sigurd and his crew probably died or their shift was sometime around the 1960s. Well, when the old birds were added to the game, if you'll remember, the old birds log entry shows things from 2150 and 2380, at least 400 years after Sigurd and his crew seemingly died, or at least well beyond the life expectancy of any normal person. Well, when the old birds were added to the game, originally at the top of the description, it included Sigurd's danger level. If you'll remember, for every creature in the game, Sigurd adds his own opinion of how dangerous a creature is to the bestiary. And at the end of the old bird's entry, he left a comical note talking about how dangerous they are. Shortly after this was added to the game, it was immediately cut by Zeekers. Now, I understand that there is a chance that Zeekers just got the timeline wrong, and like with every other entry, added a Sigurd opinion on the beast, and then thought, well, that doesn't make sense because this happened several hundred years later, and then deleted it. But in my opinion, Zeekers did not forget the timeline of his own game. I think that was left in there on purpose, because how could Sigurd leave a note in a computer 400 years after he dies? Unless it's just another Sigurd on another trip with the company, thinking that it's his first time around. This would also explain how Sigurd is able to leave bestiary entries for every single creature we come across. Normally, one interaction with one of these creatures is enough to kill the player, but Sigurd has seemingly ran into everything. Or at least he's ran into everything across his several lives. And since the company manipulates his mind and his memories, maybe that explains why when he goes to the terminal, he isn't surprised to see that he's already left an entry for something. Maybe it just fills in the memory in his head of, oh yeah, I already did that, not realizing it was an entire lifetime or several lifetimes ago. This could also explain things like what he meant when he saw Rich. Maybe he quite literally saw another variation of Rich out on the hillside from another crew that was also being sent to the same planet to feed the company more. The company chews up people and spits out the rinds and fills them with the memories of someone who at one point thought that they were working for the company on their own volition. So then maybe Rich gets pushed into another crew, and then Rich sees Sigurd out in the distance, a version of Sigurd that remembered a version of Rich. And if you follow this idea to its natural conclusion, then I believe when the player, you, plays Lethal Company, you are playing as Sigurd's crew. Because think about it, if this has been happening for hundreds of years, and we know, considering that Sigurd edited the Old Bird entry, this was happening at least 100 years ago, then what's to say that right now we're not just another disembodiment of Sigurd's original team? With the mention of Lucas coming in, I'm sure these people can be swapped in and out, and I'm not saying that particularly any one of us might be Sigurd, but it's the same variation of people being chewed up and spit back out time and time again. And I think the biggest evidence for that is one of the highest lore points in the game that has been talked about since the game first came out. If you are at the company building and you make your way over to the left after landing, you can find a hatch in the ground. The hatch will not only lead to one of Sigurd's audio logs, but it will also lead to a giant drill hidden underneath the platform. Now, this drill looks to be in an early state of construction. It has a broken wire, it has a couple of slots that look like they would fit an apparatus. The apparatus we can find in facility interiors. And there's even a spot on the wall to show hypothetically where this drill would be drilled into. And it's aiming right at the company itself. Now, a lot of people have theorized that in an eventual update to the game, we can assemble the drill and put it together for some kind of endgame. However, in one of Zeeker's early updates, he shows the concept art for this drill, in which the title of it is Desmond's Drill. This makes a lot of sense. Desmond is described by Sigurd as being the tech guy, the guy who knows how the computer works, the guy that figured out the transmissions coming from the other side of the galaxy. So it would make sense that he would be the one to assemble the drill. But does it make sense that Desmond by himself assembled the entire thing in secret at the company's front doorstep in the matter of time that he was alive on these missions? Or does it make sense that Desmond has been doing this for several hundred years over several variations of his life? What if Desmond has become aware? What if, because of his understanding of technology or because of the terminal where he leaves notes to himself, he, at every point of consciousness, every time he is brought back from the grave, realizes what's going on? What if that post-it note doesn't have to be on the wall for 500 years, because every time Desmond comes back to the ship, he puts a new one up for the next version of himself that comes through? And what if, over time, Desmond has been building the drill piece by piece to try to finally stop the company? Zeekers has mentioned that he has an end game for Lethal Company in mind, and I think that's what this end game will be. Even if I'm completely wrong about the theory of Sigurd's crew and the bodies being reanimated and all of that, I think it will involve the drill. I think we'll put the drill together and we're going to tunnel in to see the company for what it really is. And if we are Sigurd's crew, if we are still Desmond and the rest of his company, then that means it's been Desmond doing this all along. The pieces of scrap spit out by this entity forming back together to destroy the beast that made it. The only real thing left to go over in Lethal Company is a couple of intro cutscenes that have been added in recent updates to the game. The first one that was added shows the player from a first-person perspective in some kind of factory that's under attack. The ground starts shaking, alarms start going off, the person whose view we are looking through seems panicked before he turns around, and a door materializes out of the wall with some shadowy figure standing there. The other intro cutscene that we've been given is a man floating in space, seemingly a member of the company who has been ejected from the ship, which, by the way, if you fail to meet quota at any point, you just get sucked out of the airlock and thrown into space. Makes sense, right? If the company is building these bags of flesh to go get its scrap, and they can't do that, then what reason does it have to keep them? I mean, it's proven by the way the blob kills people, your suit's the only thing that matters, right? Because it's not like the company needs more flesh. In this cutscene, as someone is floating out in space, they're suddenly presented with a door which opens and the cutscene ends. Now, to me, it looks like we're watching two sides of the same scene. The person sitting at the chair is confronted with this door out of space that a figure steps through, and on the other side, we have someone stepping through the door. Now, this is clearly showing that doors are appearing to different people. Is the figure that steps into the office the same guy that was floating in space? Maybe, or maybe just the door is appearing to different people around the galaxy for some reason. Maybe this door is some ethereal entity that is looking to destroy the company. Maybe it's a manifestation of the company itself. All that I know is that this is really cool. With no exaggeration, I think Lethal Company is one of the coolest settings I have seen out of video games in a really long time. Because even if I'm wrong about all of my theories, the stuff we know for a fact is that these far future civilizations were destroyed by something, and that we're now in the remnants of their colonies and their civilizations. We know that things have evolved at a rapid pace and are destroying people, and there's intergalactic wars, and there's this monster behind the company building that chews up planets. And there's so many interesting questions about what we're doing. There's so many interesting touches of like symbolism. Like, for example, the company building itself is on a planet called Gordian, which is the capital from the story of King Midas, the king that everything he touched turned to gold. And there's a mention of the golden planet. And when we're picking up scrap, we're looking for whatever has the most worth. And things like gold bars and cash registers have a high worth. But then so do things like rubber duckies and toys and objects of memory. There's just so many, there's so much room for speculation. There's so much interesting done with it. And it leaves such a perfect note of telling you things and not telling you things, and giving you just enough clues to fill in the gaps that you can jump to insane conclusions like, you, the player, are also Sigurd, which is also a bag of bones and meat, and if your suit or your mask was to spill out, you would be a composition of flesh like a zombie. It's just, oh, it's so cool. I love this game so much. I'm so happy that it's successful in the way that it has been. I am so happy that games that take a chance, just guys making stuff for fun, can get to the level Lethal Company is at. It deserves the success that it has been given, and it has been given that success for good reason. In my opinion, I think the boat is effectively some kind of arc, that humanity had to leave Earth at some point millennia ago for whatever reason. War, decay, what have you. And now the boat is forced to work its way through the stars, and people from the boat drop off on planets randomly to try to colonize and start over. But at some point, humanity made the mistake of running into the company, a thing that eats planets. And that company is smart, and it can be many things at once. It can be on the other side of the galaxy, or it can set up things on the other side of the galaxy. It can control people's minds, it can make them lose their memories. And from there, humanity had a greater threat. Maybe the reason places like experimentation or Embryon were used in secret is because people were trying to develop weapons to use in secret against the company. Maybe that's now why the company is hiding, and why instead of eating entire planets, it just gets bags of flesh to go to planets and bring the food to it. Maybe all the weapons of war we see are things meant to destroy it or parts of it. Maybe we're the bad guy in all of this. Or maybe if Desmond can recognize the illusion, he can stop it once and for all. And even if I'm wrong about all of that, then there's still these intergalactic empires and these wars and technology used against each other. As mentioned, Zeker says he has an end game in mind, and I, for one, am excited to see it because I love everything he's done up until this point, and I can only imagine where it goes from here. I cannot stress this enough. If you have not already installed Lethal Company, do it right now. This is one of those rare times where a video game hits just the right note between community speculation and the developer actually putting matter to it. So get in on the story if you haven't already. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. Not even to say it has to go anywhere from here. If it stays right where it's at forever, then I think it's done more than enough. Sigurd is a fantastic developer, and this is a fantastic game, and I, for one, am so excited to talk about it, and I'm so excited that you all decided to listen. And above all else, I just want to say thank you for watching. I really like Lethal Company, if you couldn't tell. Like, when the game first came out, I played it with, like, Charlie and Hunter and a bunch of my friends, and we streamed it together, and it was so fun because it's terrifying at some moments and hilarious at others. But then as you dig, there's so much lore. Everything works so well off of each other. It's just, it's like a diamond in the rough, the rare occasion where you just come across something that's special. And I'm glad people saw it for what it was, that the game did as well as it did, that it's as successful as it is, because as I said, it certainly deserves it. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm insane. I haven't seen anyone say the theory that the company is making you, the player, it's like zombie puppet or whatever, basically, to go out and collect scrap for it. But to me, it's the only thing I can put together out of the clues we have at this point. Now keep in mind, after this video comes out, an update may come that completely shatters all of this, and Zeekers moves the game in his own direction, which, to clarify, he is the creator. He can do with the game whatever he wants. I'm allowed to be wrong. But let me hear your theories in the comments. Let me hear if any of this makes sense. And like I said, above all else, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Link to the game will be in the description, as I mentioned earlier, and thank you all for any support that you show it. I like to talk about art and like works of art like games and TV and movies and stuff like that a lot. It's a whole different thing when my audience supports the creators that I talk about, and it makes me feel less terrible about covering their thing, you know, for money. But for real, thank you guys very much for all the support. It means the world. So I believe that should do it for now. So thank you guys for being so cool, and I really hope that you enjoyed this video. And above all else, I really hope that you enjoyed Lethal Company. I believe that should do it for now, but I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! I don't really have a joke to make. Death to all hoarding bugs. That's the joke.